Bear kills 4 campers in Colorado. Within 12 minutes, July 20th, 2025. The morning of July 18th, 2025, dawned crisp and clear over Denver International Airport as 4 friends gathered near the United Airlines departure gate, their excitement palpable despite the early 6:47 a.m. boarding time. Evan Michael Brooks, 26 years old and recently promoted to senior software engineer at a prominent tech startup, adjusted the straps on his brand new Osprey Atmos 65-liter backpack for what felt like the 100th time. His brown hair was still damp from his hotel shower, and his green eyes reflected both anticipation and the lingering traces of pre-trip anxiety that had kept him awake most of the night. Standing beside him, Liam Patrick Ross ran his calloused fingers through his sandy blonde hair, a nervous habit he'd developed during his 8 years working as a construction foreman in Phoenix. At 28, Liam possessed the kind of weathered confidence that came from years of physical labor and outdoor experience. Though this would be his first camping trip in grizzly bear country, his steel blue eyes surveyed their gear with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to ensuring everything was properly secured before beginning any project. Natalie Grace Chen, 25, and in her final year of medical residency at Denver General Hospital, stood quietly reviewing a printed checklist she'd created on her phone 3 weeks earlier. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her dark brown eyes moved methodically down the list as she mentally confirmed each item in her meticulously organized Deuter Air Contact 60+10 pack. Despite having grown up in urban San Francisco, Natalie had developed a passion for wilderness medicine during her emergency rotation and had specifically requested this trip to gain practical experience in backcountry scenarios. The 4th member of their group, Sophia Marie Clark, bounced slightly on her toes as she scrolled through weather forecasts on her iPhone. At 24, she was the youngest of the group and worked as a marketing coordinator for an outdoor gear company in Boulder, a job that had fueled her Instagram-documented adventures throughout Colorado's Front Range. Her auburn hair caught the terminal's fluorescent lighting, and her hazel eyes sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone who had been planning this particular expedition for over 6 months. The 4 had met during their undergraduate years at the University of Colorado Boulder, where they'd bonded over late-night study sessions, shared apartments, and weekend hiking trips to easier destinations like Chautauqua Park and Mount Sanitas. After graduation, their careers had scattered them across the western United States, but they'd maintained their friendship through group text messages, annual reunions, and a shared dream of tackling a serious backcountry expedition together. Flight 1247 to Denver is now boarding all passengers, announced the gate agent, her voice cutting through the terminal's ambient noise. The announcement sent a small thrill through the group, as they knew this short connection flight would take them to their rental car pickup, then to the final preparations in Boulder before driving northwest to Rocky Mountain National Park. Evan pulled out his smartphone and opened the detailed itinerary he'd created in a shared Google Doc. Okay, so we land at 8:15, pick up the Jeep Grand Cherokee at 9:30, stop at REI for last-minute supplies by 11, grab lunch and drive to Estes Park by 2 p.m. That gives us plenty of time to check in with the ranger station and review our backcountry permit before heading to the trailhead. Liam nodded, shouldering his well-worn Kelty pack that had accompanied him on dozens of construction sites and weekend camping trips throughout Arizona's Sonoran Desert. Weather forecast still looking good for the next 4 days? Sophia consulted her phone again, scrolling through multiple weather apps with the thoroughness of someone whose job required constant attention to outdoor conditions. Tuesday and Wednesday are showing partly cloudy with highs in the mid-70s and lows in the upper 40s. Thursday might bring some afternoon thunderstorms, but nothing serious. Friday looks clear for our hike out. Perfect, Natalie said, closing her medical kit's outer pocket after one final inspection. She'd spent considerable time and money assembling a comprehensive wilderness first aid kit that included everything from basic bandages to emergency medications and a satellite communication device. I've got enough supplies to handle everything from minor cuts to serious trauma situations. As they boarded the aircraft, none of them could have anticipated that within 72 hours, 3 of them would be dead, 1 would be fighting for her life in a Denver trauma center, and their names would become permanently associated with one of the most devastating bear attacks in Colorado's recorded history. The flight to Denver passed quickly, filled with animated discussions about their planned route through the wild basin area of Rocky Mountain National Park. Evan had spent weeks researching the 11-mile loop trail that would take them past Copeland Falls, Calypso Cascades, and ultimately to their intended campsite near Ouzel Lake. The area was known for its spectacular scenery, challenging terrain, and significant wildlife populations, including elk, moose, and both black bears, and the occasional grizzly bear. According to the Park Service website, Evan explained as he pulled up detailed trail maps on his tablet, we'll gain about 2,800 feet of elevation over the first 6 miles. The trail follows the North St. Vrain Creek for most of the distance, with multiple stream crossings and some potentially challenging rocky sections. Liam studied the topographical details with professional interest. Those switchbacks near Estes Cone look serious. We'll want to take our time through that section, especially with full packs. The campsite reservations show we'll be in site number 7 at Ouzel Lake, Sophia added, consulting the confirmation emails on her phone. It's described as a secluded spot with lake access and established fire ring, though campfires might be restricted depending on current conditions. Natalie had been quietly reading through wilderness safety protocols on her tablet. The Park Service recommendations emphasize proper food storage and bear safety measures. All food, toiletries, and scented items need to be stored in approved bear canisters or hung at least 12 feet high and 4 feet from tree trunks. Upon landing in Denver, the group efficiently collected their rental vehicle and made their way to REI's flagship Boulder store, where they conducted final gear checks and purchased additional supplies. Evan added a portable water filter to supplement their planned water purification tablets, while Liam selected a compact camp shovel for waste disposal. Natalie purchased an additional emergency blanket and updated her satellite communicators subscription, and Sophia bought extra batteries for their shared GPS device and headlamps. The drive from Boulder to Estes Park took them through increasingly spectacular mountain scenery as they gained elevation and left the urban sprawl of the Front Range behind. The transition from rolling prairie to foothills to serious mountains provided a tangible sense of progression toward wilderness that heightened everyone's excitement. "Look at that weather," Sophia said, photographing the clear blue sky and dramatic cloud formations through the Jeep's sunroof. "I can't believe we're finally doing this trip." They arrived at the Rocky Mountain National Park Visitor Center in Estes Park at 2:30 p.m., where they presented their advance reservations and received their official backcountry camping permit from Ranger Patricia Henderson, a 15-year Park Service veteran with extensive experience in the Wild Basin area. "You folks picked a beautiful time of year for this hike," Ranger Henderson said as she reviewed their planned itinerary. "The wildflowers are at peak bloom around Ouzel Lake, and the weather forecast looks cooperative. However, I need to emphasize some important safety considerations for your group." She spread a detailed trail map across the counter and pointed to various landmarks along their planned route. "We've had increased bear activity throughout the Wild Basin area over the past 3 weeks. Both black bears and grizzly bears are active as they prepare for winter hibernation, and they're particularly focused on high-calorie food sources." Evan leaned forward attentively. "What specific precautions should we be taking beyond standard bear safety protocols?" First and most importantly, maintain constant awareness of your surroundings, Henderson explained. Bears in this area have become increasingly bold, and we've documented several instances of bears investigating campsites even during daylight hours. Second, make noise while hiking, especially around blind corners and dense vegetation areas. Third, keep your campsite scrupulously clean and store all food, toiletries, and scented items in approved bear containers. She handed them a printed information sheet with detailed bear safety guidelines. Fourth, if you encounter a bear, do not run. Make yourself appear large, back away slowly, and make noise. If attacked by a black bear, fight back aggressively. If attacked by a grizzly bear, play dead by lying face down and protecting your neck and head. Liam studied the trail map carefully. Are there any specific areas along our route where bear encounters are more likely? The section between Calypso Cascades and Ouzel Lake has shown the highest activity levels recently, Henderson replied. There's abundant berry growth in that area, and bears are concentrated there for feeding. Additionally, the campsite areas around Ouzel Lake provide water access that attracts both bears and their prey species. Natalie made detailed notes on her smartphone. What's the protocol if we need emergency assistance? Cell phone coverage is extremely limited throughout the Wild Basin area, Henderson explained. Your satellite communicator will be your primary emergency contact method. If you activate it, we'll receive GPS coordinates and can dispatch rescue personnel. But response times can range from 2 to 6 hours depending on weather conditions and helicopter availability. After completing their permit process and purchasing additional bear spray from the visitor center gift shop, the group drove the final 8 miles to the Wild Basin Trailhead parking area. The lot was approximately half full with vehicles belonging to day hikers and other backpackers, creating a reassuring sense of activity and community. They spent 45 minutes conducting final gear checks and organizing their packs according to weight distribution and accessibility requirements. Evan carried the group's water filtration system and emergency shelter. Liam handled the cooking equipment and shared camping gear. Natalie bore responsibility for the comprehensive medical kit and emergency communication device, and Sophia managed the group's photography equipment and detailed trail guides. At 4:15 p.m., they set off from the trailhead under perfect weather conditions. The temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees, with light winds and scattered clouds that provided occasional shade without threatening precipitation. The initial mile of trail followed a well-maintained path through dense forest of lodgepole pine, spruce, and aspen trees, with the constant sound of North St. Vrain Creek providing a pleasant background soundtrack. "This is exactly what I needed," Evan said as they crossed the first wooden bridge spanning the creek. 3 months of debugging software problems and sitting in conference rooms, and now this. The trail gained elevation gradually but steadily, requiring occasional rest stops as their bodies adjusted to the altitude and weight of their fully loaded packs. At 5:30 p.m., they reached Copeland Falls, where they took their first extended break and consumed energy bars while photographing the spectacular cascade. "The water flow is perfect," Sophia observed, capturing multiple angles of the waterfall with her digital camera. Not too high from spring runoff, not too low from late summer drought. Continuing beyond Copeland Falls, the trail became more challenging as it wound through increasingly rugged terrain. The path narrowed in several sections, requiring single-file hiking through areas where mountain oak and willow bushes encroached from both sides. Liam, hiking in the lead position, maintained a steady pace while calling out potential hazards like loose rocks and root systems. At 6:45 p.m., they reached Calypso Cascades, another spectacular waterfall that marked roughly the halfway point of their planned hiking day. The area around the falls was dotted with other backpackers taking photographs and enjoying snacks, creating a festival-like atmosphere that temporarily masked the wilderness setting's inherent dangers. "We're making excellent time," Natalie announced after consulting their GPS device and comparing their position to the planned itinerary. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach Uzel Lake around 8 p.m., which gives us plenty of time to set up camp before dark." The section of trail beyond Calypso Cascades immediately became more demanding, with steeper grades and rockier footing that required careful attention to each step. The forest grew denser, with larger trees creating a canopy that reduced ambient light levels and created numerous shadowy areas where visibility became limited. "Remember what the ranger said about making noise in areas like this?" Evan called back to the group as they entered a particularly dense section of forest. "Bears use these thick areas for cover during the day. For the next hour, they maintained a steady stream of conversation while hiking, discussing everything from work experiences to future travel plans. The constant human voices served the dual purpose of maintaining group cohesion and providing the noise levels recommended for bear safety in active habitat areas. At 7:50 p.m., they crested a small ridge and caught their first glimpse of Uzel Lake spread out below them. The pristine alpine lake reflected the surrounding peaks and forest in perfect stillness, creating a mirror-like surface that seemed almost artificial in its perfection. Scattered around the lake's perimeter, they could see several established campsites, most of which appeared to be unoccupied. "That's absolutely incredible," Sophia breathed, immediately reaching for her camera to capture the panoramic view. "I can't believe we have this place almost entirely to ourselves." They descended the final quarter mile to the lake shore and located campsite number 7, which proved to be ideally situated on a small peninsula that jutted into the lake's eastern shore. The site featured an established fire ring, level tent platforms, and convenient access to both water and the designated bear storage area. "This is perfect," Liam declared as he began unpacking his gear. "Level ground, wind protection from those trees, and easy water access. We couldn't have asked for better conditions." The group spent the next 90 minutes setting up their camp with meticulous attention to both comfort and safety protocols. Evan and Liam erected their 2-person tent on the northernmost platform, while Natalie and Sophia established their identical shelter on the southern platform, approximately 30 feet away. Both tents were high-quality 4-season models designed to withstand mountain weather conditions, with full rainfly coverage and vestibules for gear storage. Sophia prepared their first backcountry dinner using a lightweight camping stove and pre-packaged meal components that required only boiling water and careful stirring. The menu consisted of freeze-dried beef stroganoff with additional vegetables and energy-dense additions that would provide adequate calories for the next day's hiking activities. "This actually tastes better than I expected," Natalie commented as they sat around the fire ring eating dinner and watching the sunset paint the surrounding peaks in brilliant shades of orange and red. "Maybe backcountry cooking isn't as challenging as I thought." As darkness settled over the lake, they carefully extinguished their small campfire and secured all food, toiletries, and scented items in the approved bear-proof storage containers located 50 yards from their campsite. The storage process required multiple trips and careful organization, but they approached it with the seriousness emphasized during their ranger briefing. "I know this seems excessive," Evan said as they made their final storage check, using headlamps to illuminate the area around the bear boxes. "But I keep thinking about what Ranger Henderson said about increased bear activity in this specific area." They retired to their respective tents at 10:30 p.m., with plans to wake at dawn for a day hike to several alpine lakes deeper into the wilderness area. The night was crystal clear, with spectacular star visibility, and the only sounds were gentle water lapping against the shore and occasional distant calls from elk herds moving through the valley below. None of them slept particularly well that first night, partly due to excitement and partly due to the unfamiliar sounds and sensations of wilderness camping. Evan lay awake, listening to every crack of settling wood and rustle of wind through leaves, while Liam found himself automatically cataloguing the various noises as his construction experience had trained him to remain alert to environmental hazards. In the other tent, Natalie periodically checked her watch and reviewed emergency protocols in her mind, while Sophia dozed fitfully between taking notes for the detailed trip report she planned to create for her company's blog and social media accounts. Wednesday, July 19th, dawned clear and cool, with morning temperatures in the upper 40s and a thin layer of frost covering their tent flies. The group woke naturally as sunlight began filtering through the forest canopy around 6:30 a.m., and they were fully dressed and moving around their campsite by 7 a.m. "I feel like I slept on concrete," Liam groaned as he stretched outside his tent, working out the kinks from spending 8 hours on a sleeping pad that seemed considerably thinner than it had in the outdoor gear store. Sophia was already firing up the camp stove to boil water for coffee and oatmeal. "The sunrise on the lake is absolutely incredible. I've been taking photos for the past 20 minutes, and the light keeps changing." Breakfast consisted of instant oatmeal enhanced with dried fruit and nuts, strong coffee, and energy bars that would provide sustained fuel for their planned day hike to Bluebird Lake and Lake of Glass. According to their trail guide, the round-trip distance would be approximately 8 miles, with significant elevation gain, making it a challenging but achievable day for their fitness levels. Today's forecast shows partly cloudy, with a high of 78 and possible afternoon thunderstorms, Natalie reported after checking multiple weather apps on her satellite communicator. "We should plan to be back at camp by 3 p.m. to avoid any lightning risk." They departed their campsite at 8:45 a.m., carrying day packs loaded with water, snacks, emergency supplies, and photography equipment. The morning air was crisp and invigorating, filled with the scents of pine resin, wildflowers, and the clean smell of mountain water. The trail beyond Uzel Lake climbed steadily through increasingly alpine terrain, with the forest gradually transitioning from dense timber to more open areas interspersed with meadows full of blooming wildflowers. Indian paintbrush, lupine, and columbine created spectacular color displays that provided frequent opportunities for photography stops. "The elevation is definitely affecting me more than I expected," Evan admitted during a rest break at approximately 9,800 feet. "I thought all those months of cycling in Denver would have prepared me better for this altitude." "We're gaining elevation faster than our bodies can adjust," Natalie explained, monitoring their progress on the GPS device. "The key is maintaining a steady but conservative pace and staying properly hydrated." They reached Bluebird Lake at 11:30 a.m., where they spent 45 minutes exploring the shoreline, eating lunch, and photographing the spectacular mountain reflections in the perfectly still water. The lake was completely deserted, except for a family of marmots that observed their activities from a respectful distance among the surrounding rock formations. "This is why we planned this trip," Sophia said, capturing panoramic photographs of the lake and surrounding peaks. "Every cubicle hour and traffic jam was worth it for moments like this." The hike to Lake of Glass required an additional hour of steep climbing through increasingly rugged terrain that tested their endurance and route-finding abilities. The trail became less distinct as they gained elevation, requiring careful attention to cairns and map reading to maintain the correct path. Lake of Glass proved to be the highlight of their day, a pristine alpine tarn nestled in a cirque, surrounded by dramatic granite walls that rose nearly vertically from the water's edge. The lake's surface was so perfectly still and reflective that it created a disorienting mirror effect that made photography challenging but spectacular. "I can't believe places like this actually exist," Liam said, sitting on a boulder beside the lake and soaking in the profound silence that seemed to amplify the remoteness of their location. "This is like something from a fantasy novel." They began their descent back to Uzel Lake at 2:15 p.m., making good time on the downhill sections while carefully monitoring for afternoon thunderstorm development. The weather remained cooperative throughout their return hike, with only scattered clouds and light breezes that made for ideal hiking conditions. By 4:30 p.m., they were back at their campsite, tired but exhilarated by their successful day hike and the spectacular scenery they'd experienced. The late afternoon sun slanted across the lake surface, creating perfect conditions for relaxation and camp maintenance activities. "Tomorrow, we tackle the loop back to the trailhead," Evan announced as they prepared dinner. "It's about 7 miles with some challenging sections, but we should be back to the parking area by early afternoon." Their second night at Uzel Lake passed more peacefully than the first, as their bodies had adjusted to the camping conditions and they felt more confident about their wilderness skills. However, around 2:30 a.m., both tents were awakened by the sound of something large moving through the forest approximately 50 yards from their campsite. "Did everyone else hear that?" Natalie whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible through the tent fabric. "Yeah," Liam responded quietly. "Sounded like something big walking through the underbrush. Probably just an elk." They listened intently for several minutes, but the sounds didn't repeat, and eventually they drifted back to sleep. None of them mentioned the incident during breakfast preparation, and it was quickly forgotten in the excitement of breaking camp and preparing for their final day's hike. Thursday, July 20th, dawned overcast with a thin layer of clouds that suggested the possibility of afternoon weather development. The temperature was noticeably warmer than the previous morning, and the air felt heavy with humidity that indicated changing atmospheric conditions. "Looks like those afternoon thunderstorms might actually materialize today," Sophia observed while checking her weather apps. "We should definitely plan to be out of the high country by early afternoon." They completed their camp breakdown efficiently, having developed a systematic approach to packing that minimized time and ensured nothing was forgotten. All trash was carefully policed and packed out, and the campsite was left in pristine condition according to leave no trace principles. "Final bear box check," Evan announced, walking over to ensure they hadn't accidentally left any items in the storage containers. "All clear. Everything's accounted for." At 9:15 a.m., they shouldered their fully loaded packs and began the 7-mile hike back to the Wild Basin trailhead. The route would take them past their previous stopping points in reverse order, with a planned lunch break at Calypso Cascades before the final descent to the parking area. The morning hiking was pleasant, despite the overcast conditions, with comfortable temperatures and sufficient cloud cover to prevent overheating during the more strenuous uphill sections. They maintained good spirits and steady progress, stopping periodically to photograph landmarks they'd noted during their inbound hike. "I'm already planning our next backcountry trip," Sophia announced during a water break near the 10,000-foot elevation mark. "Maybe something in the Maroon Bells area, or possibly the Sangre de Cristo range. Let's see how sore we are tomorrow before committing to future suffering." Liam laughed, adjusting his pack straps to redistribute weight across his shoulders. At 11:45 a.m., they reached the junction where the loop trail reconnected with their inbound route near Calypso Cascades. The area was busier than it had been during their previous visit, with multiple day hiking groups taking breaks and several other backpackers preparing for trips deeper into the wilderness. "This feels almost crowded after having Uzel Lake to ourselves," Natalie commented as they found an unoccupied boulder where they could eat lunch and rest their feet. During their lunch break, They were approached by an ascending backpacker named Michael Torres, a 34-year-old wilderness guide from Fort Collins, who had been leading trips in Rocky Mountain National Park for over a decade. Torres was hiking alone on a scouting trip for future client expeditions and was eager to share information about current trail conditions. "How was the lake?" Torres asked, settling his pack beside theirs and pulling out a water bottle. "I'm thinking about recommending that area for a family group next month." "Absolutely spectacular," Evan replied enthusiastically. "Perfect weather, great campsite, and virtually no crowds. We only saw 2 other groups during our entire stay." Torres nodded approvingly. "That's what I like to hear. Any wildlife encounters worth noting?" "Oh, we heard something large moving around our campsite one night," Liam mentioned. "Probably just elk, but it definitely got our attention." Torres's expression became more serious. "What time of night and which direction from your campsite?" "Around 2:30 a.m., maybe 50 yards into the forest on the north side of the lake," Natalie replied. "Why? Is that significant?" "Maybe not," Torres said carefully, "but I've been getting reports of unusual bear activity in that specific area over the past 2 weeks. Rangers have documented at least 3 different bears using the lake area for water access, including one large grizzly that's been particularly aggressive around food sources." The information sent a slight chill through the group, even though they were now safely departed from the area in question. "We followed all the bear safety protocols," Sophia assured him. "Food storage, clean campsite, bear spray readily available." "I'm sure you did everything right," Torres replied, "but this particular bear has shown some concerning behaviors. He's been investigating campsites even when they're properly maintained, and he doesn't seem to have the normal fear response to human presence." Torres provided them with additional details about recent bear encounters, including an incident 3 days earlier where a family camping near Estes Cone had been awakened by a large grizzly bear attempting to access their bear storage containers, despite proper food storage protocols. "The bear spent over an hour at their campsite," Torres explained. "He systematically investigated every piece of equipment and actually damaged their tent while they were inside it. Park Service is considering closing the area if the behavior escalates." After finishing lunch and exchanging contact information with Torres, the group continued their descent toward the trailhead with heightened awareness of their surroundings. The encounter had reminded them that they were still in active bear habitat and needed to maintain vigilance until they reached their vehicle. "I'm glad we're heading out today," Natalie admitted as they crossed the wooden bridge below Calypso Cascades. "That information about the aggressive bear is definitely unsettling." The afternoon weather began developing exactly as predicted, with increasing cloud cover and the distant rumble of thunder that suggested precipitation would arrive within a few hours. They picked up their pace slightly, motivated by both the approaching weather and their desire to complete the hike before conditions deteriorated. At 2:20 p.m., they reached Copeland Falls for their final rest break before the last mile of hiking to the trailhead. The waterfall seemed more dramatic than during their inbound hike, possibly due to recent rainfall in the higher elevations that had increased the water flow. "1 more mile and we're back to civilization," Evan announced, shouldering his pack for the final time on this expedition. "Hot showers, real food, and beds that don't require inflation." The last mile of trail descended steadily through familiar forest that seemed almost mundane after their spectacular alpine experiences. However, their fatigue was beginning to show, and the weight of their packs felt more oppressive than it had during any previous portion of the hike. At 3:35 p.m., they emerged from the forest and saw the Wild Basin trailhead parking area spread out before them. Their Jeep Grand Cherokee sat exactly where they'd left it, looking both familiar and strangely foreign after 3 days in the wilderness. "We did it," Sophia declared triumphantly, dropping her pack beside the vehicle and stretching her arms overhead. "Our first real backcountry expedition, and we survived without any major disasters." They spent 15 minutes transferring gear from their packs to the vehicle, organizing equipment and changing into clean clothes they'd left in the car. The transformation from wilderness backpackers to regular tourists felt dramatic and slightly disorienting. "I vote for the biggest burger and coldest beer in Estes Park," Liam announced as they secured their packs in the cargo area, followed by the longest hot shower in recorded history. As they drove away from the trailhead at 4 p.m., none of them looked back toward the forest that had provided such spectacular experiences and memories. They were already deep in conversation about future adventures, restaurant choices for dinner, and plans for sharing their photographs with friends and family. The trip had been everything they'd hoped for and more: challenging hiking, spectacular scenery, perfect weather, and the deep satisfaction that comes from successfully completing a demanding wilderness expedition. As far as they were concerned, it had been a perfect adventure that would serve as the foundation for many future trips together. However, what they didn't know was that approximately 90 minutes after their departure, a park ranger conducting routine patrol would discover fresh bear sign throughout their former campsite area, including claw marks on trees, disturbed ground, and scat, indicating that a large bear had thoroughly investigated the area within hours of their departure. The bear in question was a 9-year-old male grizzly bear designated as Bear 147 by the Park Service, weighing approximately 450 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder. For the past 3 weeks, Bear 147 had been exhibiting increasingly bold behavior around human campsites, possibly due to a dental injury that made normal foraging difficult and increased his interest in easily accessible human food sources. Park Service records would later show that Bear 147 had been observed near Ouzel Lake on at least 6 occasions during the month of July, including twice during daylight hours when campers were present. His behavior pattern suggested he was learning to associate human presence with food availability, a dangerous development that wildlife managers had been monitoring with growing concern. The investigation that would follow the discovery of bear sign at their campsite would reveal that Bear 147 had likely been aware of their presence throughout their entire stay at Ouzel Lake. Behavioral analysis suggested the bear had been observing their activities from concealed positions in the dense forest, learning their patterns and waiting for optimal opportunities to investigate their equipment and food storage areas. Wildlife cameras installed near the lake 3 days after their departure would capture footage of Bear 147 methodically examining every location where they had walked, cooked, and stored gear. The bear demonstrated remarkable intelligence in his investigation, spending particular attention on areas where food had been prepared and consumed. But none of this information would become available until much later, and the 4 friends spent their final evening in Colorado celebrating their successful adventure at a popular restaurant in Estes Park, completely unaware of how narrowly they had avoided what could have been a catastrophic encounter. Their flight back to Denver International Airport departed at 11:45 a.m. on Friday, July 21st, giving them time for a leisurely breakfast and final equipment check before returning their rental vehicle. The conversation during breakfast focused primarily on planning their next adventure, with tentative discussions about attempting a more challenging route in the same area during the following summer. "We should definitely go back to that area," Evan suggested over his pancakes and coffee. "Maybe try some of the more remote lakes that Torres mentioned. The wildlife viewing opportunities could be incredible." "I'd love to do some wilderness medicine training before we attempt anything more remote," Natalie added. Yesterday made me realize how far we'd be from help if someone got seriously injured. Their flight departed on schedule, and by 2:30 p.m. they were back in Denver, where they collected their checked luggage and prepared to separate for their returns to respective home cities. The group hug in the terminal was emotional, filled with the satisfaction of shared accomplishment and genuine sadness at returning to their normal routines. "Same time next year?" Sophia asked as they prepared to head to different departure gates. "Maybe something even more ambitious?" "Absolutely," Liam replied without hesitation. "I'm already researching options for multi-week expeditions. Maybe something in Alaska or the Canadian Rockies." They separated at 3:15 p.m., each heading to different airlines and destinations, their conversation continuing via group text messages as they waited for their respective flights. The text thread remained active throughout the afternoon and evening as they shared final photographs, compared notes about gear performance, and began the process of planning future adventures. By midnight on Friday, July 21st, they were all safely back in their respective homes, unpacking gear, doing laundry, and beginning the process of returning to their normal work routines. The wilderness adventure that had seemed so challenging and significant while they were living, it was already beginning to feel like a distant memory as they reintegrated into urban life. What none of them could have imagined was that their names would soon become part of Rocky Mountain National Park's official incident reports, not as victims, but as the last people to successfully camp at Ouzel Lake before it was permanently closed to overnight visitors due to escalating bear safety concerns. Bear 147's behavior continued to deteriorate throughout the remainder of July and into August. 3 separate camping groups reported aggressive encounters, including 2 incidents where the bear made physical contact with tents and equipment despite proper food storage protocols. Wildlife managers made the difficult decision to close the entire Ouzel Lake area to overnight camping effective August 15, 2025. On September 3, 2025, Bear 147 was involved in a serious incident near Estes Cone, where he charged a family of day hikers, resulting in minor injuries and requiring emergency evacuation by helicopter. The incident prompted park officials to authorize lethal removal, and Bear 147 was shot and killed by wildlife officers on September 8, 2025. The necropsy revealed extensive dental damage that explained his altered behavior and increased reliance on human food sources. Wildlife veterinarians determined that Bear 147 had likely been in considerable pain for several months, which had driven his increasingly desperate and aggressive attempts to access easily digestible human food. When Evan, Liam, Natalie, and Sophia learned about these developments through news reports and social media posts, they experienced a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they had avoided a potentially fatal encounter was tempered by sadness about the bear's ultimate fate and recognition of how different their story could have been. "We were probably being watched the entire time we were there," Natalie wrote in the group text thread after reading the detailed news reports. "The fact that nothing happened was probably just luck. Or maybe our bear safety protocols actually worked," Evan replied optimistically. "We did everything right, and maybe that made the difference." The experience added a sobering dimension to their wilderness adventures and influenced their approach to future trips. They began investing more heavily in bear safety equipment, took a wilderness first aid course together, and developed more comprehensive emergency planning for subsequent expeditions. Their successful Ouzel Lake adventure became a foundational experience that shaped their approach to wilderness travel for years to come. It represented both the spectacular rewards of backcountry exploration and the genuine risks that made such adventures meaningful and memorable. However, the story of Bear 147 and what happened at Uzel Lake would soon be overshadowed by events that would transform their names from a wilderness success story into something far more tragic and permanent in Colorado's outdoor recreation history. The following summer, exactly 1 year after their Uzel Lake expedition, the four friends planned a return trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. This time, they would be hiking as a group of 5, having invited Sophia's younger brother Marcus to join them for what they planned as an even more ambitious backcountry adventure. Marcus David Clark was 22 years old and worked as a ski instructor in Aspen during the winter months and a river rafting guide during the summer season. At 6 feet 2 inches and 185 pounds, he possessed the athletic build and outdoor experience that made him an ideal addition to their hiking group. His enthusiasm for wilderness adventures matched his sister's, and he had been asking to join one of their expeditions for over 2 years. The 5 friends had spent months planning what they called their redemption trip, a 5-day, 4-night expedition that would take them deep into the most remote sections of Rocky Mountain National Park's backcountry. Their planned route would cover approximately 35 miles and include some of the most challenging and spectacular terrain the park had to offer. Their destination was the Mummy Range, a collection of high peaks in the northern section of the park that offered isolation, technical hiking challenges, and spectacular alpine scenery. Unlike their previous trip to the popular Wild Basin area, this expedition would take them far from established trail systems and into terrain that required advanced navigation skills and self-sufficiency. The group had invested significantly in upgraded equipment for this expedition. New GPS devices, satellite communicators with two-way messaging capability, enhanced first aid supplies, and lightweight camping gear that would allow them to cover longer distances with reduced pack weight. They had also completed wilderness medicine training and practiced emergency response scenarios. "This is going to be the trip of a lifetime," Marcus declared during their final planning meeting in Boulder 3 days before their departure. 5 days completely cut off from civilization, incredible peaks, and probably not another soul for miles. Their permits had been approved for backcountry camping in the Hague Creek drainage, an area known for its remote alpine lakes, challenging cross-country travel, and abundant wildlife populations. The area required advanced hiking experience and was recommended only for groups with significant wilderness skills and proper emergency preparedness. "According to the ranger briefing materials, we could go the entire 5 days without seeing another person," Evan said, reviewing the detailed trail descriptions and safety recommendations. "The nearest emergency assistance would be at least 6 hours away, even with helicopter access." The enhanced isolation was exactly what they were seeking after their previous year's experience with the relatively crowded conditions near popular destinations. This trip would provide the ultimate wilderness experience they had been working toward since beginning their backcountry hiking progression. However, their careful planning and upgraded equipment would prove insufficient to protect them from the events that would unfold during their second expedition to Rocky Mountain National Park. The wilderness that had provided such spectacular memories during their first trip would become the setting for one of the most tragic incidents in the park's history. The date was Monday, July 18, 2026, exactly 2 years after their first meeting at Denver International Airport. The 5 friends gathered once again at the airport, but this time their excitement was tempered by a more mature understanding of wilderness risks and the serious nature of their planned expedition. "Weather forecast looks perfect for the entire 5 days," Sophia announced as they waited for their connecting flight to Denver. "Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and no precipitation expected until after our planned departure. I've been studying topographical maps for this area for 3 months, Marcus added, spreading detailed charts across the airport seating area. The route finding is going to be challenging, but I think we're ready for it." Their flight to Denver departed on schedule, and by late afternoon, they were once again driving northwest from Boulder toward Rocky Mountain National Park. This time, however, their destination was the less developed trailhead at Corral Creek, which would provide access to their planned route into the Mummy Range wilderness. "This feels different from last year," Natalie observed as they drove through increasingly remote terrain toward their trailhead. "More serious, more committing. Once we're out there, we're really on our own." "That's exactly what makes it exciting," Liam replied, checking their gear list one final time. "This is the kind of adventure we've been building toward for years." But they reached the Corral Creek trailhead at 4:30 p.m. and immediately began the familiar process of organizing gear, conducting final equipment checks, and preparing for their departure the following morning. The trailhead area was completely deserted, except for their vehicle, reinforcing the remote nature of their planned expedition. "Tomorrow we head into some of the most remote wilderness in Colorado," Evan announced as they set up their first night's camp at the designated car camping area near the trailhead. 5 days of incredible scenery, serious hiking challenges, and complete self-sufficiency. Their first night passed peacefully, filled with anticipation and final preparations for the challenging days ahead. They woke before dawn on Tuesday, July 19th, and were hiking by 6:30 a.m. under perfect weather conditions that promised an ideal start to their expedition. The initial miles of trail followed Hague Creek through dense forest and gradual elevation gain that allowed them to warm up their hiking muscles while adjusting to their fully loaded packs. The creek provided a constant water source and pleasant background sounds that made the early morning hiking particularly enjoyable. "This is why we do this," Marcus said during their first rest break, breathing deeply of the crisp mountain air and surveying the spectacular scenery surrounding them. No schedules, no deadlines, no phone calls, just hiking, camping, and incredible views. By late afternoon on Tuesday, they had reached their first planned campsite at approximately 10,200 feet elevation near the headwaters of Hague Creek. The site was completely isolated, with 360-degree views of surrounding peaks and no evidence of recent human presence. "We could be the first people to camp in this exact spot," Sophia mused as they set up their tents and organized their campsite. "That's an incredible feeling." Their second day of hiking took them off established trails and into cross-country terrain that required careful navigation and route-finding skills. The landscape became increasingly alpine, with fewer trees and more open terrain that provided spectacular views but also increased exposure to weather changes. "Navigation is going to be crucial from here on," Evan announced as they studied their GPS devices and compared their position to detailed topographical maps. "One wrong turn could add hours to our hiking time or put us in dangerous terrain." By Wednesday evening, they had established their second campsite at 11,400 feet elevation, well above treeline and completely exposed to the dramatic mountain weather that characterized high-altitude environments. The site provided stunning panoramic views, but also reminded them of their vulnerability to sudden weather changes. "Tomorrow, we go for the summit of Hague Peak," Marcus announced excitedly as they prepared dinner and watched the sunset paint the surrounding mountains in brilliant colors. "If conditions hold, we should have one of the most spectacular days of hiking any of us has ever experienced." Thursday, July 21st, dawned crystal clear with perfect conditions for their planned summit attempt. They departed their high camp at 5:30 a.m., carrying light day packs with water, snacks, and emergency equipment for what they expected to be a challenging but achievable 12-hour round trip. The summit route required technical scrambling over loose rock and careful attention to route finding through terrain that showed little evidence of previous human passage. The physical challenge was significant, but the scenery and sense of achievement made every step worthwhile. "This is unbelievable," Natalie declared as they reached the 13,560-foot summit of Hague Peak at 11:45 a.m. 360-degree views, perfect weather, and we have this incredible place completely to ourselves. They spent 90 minutes on the summit, photographing the spectacular views, eating lunch, and savoring the achievement of reaching one of Rocky Mountain National Park's most remote and challenging peaks. The sense of accomplishment was profound, representing the culmination of years of training and preparation. "This is definitely the highlight of all our hiking adventures," Liam announced, as they prepared to begin their descent. "I can't imagine any future trip topping this experience." The descent from Hague Peak proved more challenging than anticipated, with loose rock and steep terrain that required careful attention to footing and route selection. They reached their high camp at 4:15 p.m., tired but exhilarated by their successful summit and the spectacular conditions they had experienced. "Tomorrow we start the long hike back to civilization," Evan announced as they prepared their final backcountry dinner. "Part of me doesn't want this trip to end. We should start planning the next one before we even get home," Sophia suggested, already thinking ahead to future adventures that could build on this expedition's success. Maybe something even more remote and challenging. Their final night in the high country passed peacefully under a spectacular star display that seemed to emphasize the pristine wilderness environment they had been privileged to experience. The temperature dropped well below freezing, but their upgraded equipment kept them comfortable throughout the night. Friday, July 22nd, began with the complex process of breaking their high-altitude camp and preparing for the long descent back to their vehicle. The route would take them approximately 8 miles through challenging terrain that would require most of the day to complete safely. "Weather looks good for our hike out," Marcus reported after checking multiple forecasting sources on their satellite communicator. "Clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for a safe descent." They departed their final campsite at 7:30 a.m., carrying fully loaded packs for what they expected to be their most challenging hiking day of the expedition. The route required descending over 3,000 feet of elevation while navigating complex terrain that included stream crossings, boulder fields, and dense forest sections. "Take your time and be careful with footing," Evan advised, as they began the steep descent from their high camp. "We've made it this far without any injuries, and I'd like to keep it that way." The morning hiking proceeded smoothly despite the challenging terrain, with the group maintaining good spirits and steady progress toward their vehicle. They took frequent breaks to rest their knees and ankles, which were bearing the impact of sustained downhill hiking with heavy packs. At 11:30 a.m., they reached the confluence of 2 creek drainages, where their route rejoined the established trail system for the final 4 miles to the trailhead. The transition from cross-country navigation to marked trails felt like a return to civilization, even though they were still deep in the wilderness. "4 more miles and we're back to the real world," Natalie announced during their lunch break, beside a spectacular waterfall that had carved deep pools in the granite bedrock. Hot showers, cold drinks, and sleeping on something other than the ground. The afternoon hiking continued uneventfully as they followed the established trail through increasingly familiar terrain toward their vehicle. Their fatigue was noticeable, but their spirits remained high as they reflected on the spectacular experiences of the past 5 days. At 3:45 p.m., they emerged from the forest and saw their Jeep Grand Cherokee waiting in the otherwise empty trailhead parking area. The sight of their vehicle represented successful completion of their most ambitious wilderness expedition and safe return from some of Colorado's most remote terrain. "We did it again," Marcus declared triumphantly, dropping his pack beside the vehicle and stretching his tired muscles. 5 days in some of the most incredible wilderness I've ever seen, and everyone made it back safely." They spent 20 minutes transferring gear from their packs to the vehicle and changing into clean clothes they had stored for their return to civilization. The transformation felt dramatic after 5 days of wilderness living, and they were eager to begin celebrating their successful expedition. "Dinner at the best restaurant in Estes Park," Sophia announced as they secured their equipment and prepared to leave the wilderness behind. "We've definitely earned a proper celebration." As they drove away from the Corral Creek trailhead at 4:15 p.m., they were already deep in conversation about the highlights of their expedition and preliminary discussions about future adventures. The trip had exceeded all their expectations and provided memories that would last for years. "This has to be our annual tradition," Evan declared as they drove through the spectacular mountain scenery toward Estes Park. "Every summer, a bigger and more challenging expedition. Maybe next year we tackle something in Alaska or the Canadian Rockies." "I'm already researching options," Marcus replied enthusiastically. "There are some incredible multi-week expeditions that would be the ultimate test of our wilderness skills." Their celebration dinner that evening was filled with detailed recounting of their expedition's highlights, analysis of their gear performance, and excited planning for future adventures. The successful completion of such a challenging expedition had increased their confidence and appetite for even more ambitious undertakings. They spent Saturday morning, July 23rd, organizing and cleaning their equipment before preparing for their afternoon flights back to their respective home cities. The gear sorting process provided opportunities to evaluate what had worked well and what might need upgrading for future expeditions. "Our equipment performed flawlessly," Liam observed as they conducted final gear checks. 5 days of challenging conditions and everything held up exactly as expected. "The investment in upgraded gear definitely paid off," Natalie agreed, packing her comprehensive medical kit that had fortunately remained unused throughout the expedition. "Better equipment makes these kinds of adventures both safer and more enjoyable." Their flights departed Denver International Airport at 2:30 p.m., with the group once again separating for returns to different cities and the resumption of their normal work routines. The conversation continued via group text messages throughout their travel day as they shared final photographs and began processing the experiences of their expedition. By Sunday evening, July 24th, they were all back in their respective homes, beginning the familiar process of unpacking gear, doing laundry, and readjusting to urban life after 5 days in the wilderness. The expedition had been everything they had hoped for and more, providing challenges, spectacular scenery, and the deep satisfaction of successful completion. "Best adventure of our lives," read the final group text message that evening. "Same time next year, somewhere even more spectacular." None of them could have anticipated that their next wilderness expedition would be their last together, or that their names would soon become permanently associated with one of the most tragic incidents in Rocky Mountain National Park's history. The confidence and skills they had developed over years of successful adventures would prove insufficient to protect them from the events that would unfold during their third expedition to Colorado's wilderness. The planning for their third annual expedition began in earnest during the fall of 2026. With the group determined to attempt their most ambitious adventure yet. Their success in the Mummy Range had increased their confidence and appetite for even more challenging undertakings, leading them to consider destinations that would test the limits of their wilderness skills and endurance. "I've been researching some incredible options in the Sangre de Cristo Range," Marcus reported during a video conference call in October. "There are some remote, high-elevation routes that would give us the ultimate wilderness experience." "What about going back to our roots in Rocky Mountain National Park?" Sophia suggested. There are still areas we haven't explored, and we know the terrain and regulations. After extensive research and discussion, they settled on a return to Rocky Mountain National Park for a July 2027 expedition that would take them into the park's most remote and challenging terrain. Their planned destination was the rarely visited northwest section of the park, accessed through the remote Tonahutu Creek Trail system. This area sees maybe a dozen visitors per year, Evan explained as he presented their research findings during a December planning meeting. It's the ultimate wilderness experience right in our favorite park. The Tonahutu Creek area offered everything they were seeking: complete isolation, spectacular scenery, challenging navigation requirements, and the opportunity to explore terrain that few people ever experienced. Their planned route would cover approximately 40 miles over 6 days, including off-trail travel through some of the park's most rugged landscape. "This will definitely be our most challenging expedition yet," Natalie observed, as they studied detailed topographical maps of their planned route. "The logistics alone are going to require careful planning and preparation." Throughout the winter and spring of 2027, the group invested heavily in further equipment upgrades and skills development. They completed advanced wilderness medicine training, practiced technical navigation skills, and participated in search and rescue training that would enhance their emergency preparedness. "We're as prepared as we can possibly be," Liam declared during their final planning meeting in June 2027. "The equipment is perfect, our skills are solid, and we've planned for every contingency we can imagine." Their expedition was scheduled for Monday, July 18th through Saturday, July 23rd, 2027, exactly 3 years after their first wilderness adventure together. The symmetry seemed appropriate as they prepared for what they expected to be the culmination of their progression through increasingly challenging wilderness expeditions. "This is going to be the adventure of a lifetime," Marcus announced as they conducted final gear checks during their last meeting before departure. 6 days in some of the most remote wilderness in Colorado, incredible scenery, and the ultimate test of everything we've learned. However, what they didn't know was that their carefully planned expedition would intersect with circumstances beyond their control, leading to events that would transform their adventure into one of the most tragic incidents in Rocky Mountain National Park's recorded history. The date was Monday, July 18th, 2027, exactly 3 years after their first meeting at Denver International Airport for their inaugural wilderness expedition. This time, however, their excitement was tempered by a more mature understanding of wilderness risks and the serious nature of their most ambitious planned expedition. But this story, the real story that would make headlines across the nation and forever change how visitors approached wilderness safety in bear country, begins not with their successful expeditions of previous years, but with what happened on their fourth and final trip together. The date was July 20th, 2025, and the 4 friends who had successfully completed their Uzel Lake expedition exactly 1 year earlier were preparing for what they believed would be another routine camping trip to their favorite area of Rocky Mountain National Park. This time, they had invited 2 additional friends to join them, expanding their group to 6 experienced hikers for what they planned as a relaxed long weekend in familiar territory. Sarah Michelle Rivera, 27 years old and working as a marketing manager for a Denver-based outdoor equipment company, had been begging to join one of their expeditions for over 18 months. At 5 feet 6 inches, with shoulder-length brown hair and an athletic build developed through years of rock climbing and trail running, Sarah possessed the outdoor experience and enthusiasm that made her an ideal addition to their group. David Lee Thompson, 29 and employed as a graphic designer specializing in outdoor industry clients, completed their expanded group of 6. David's passion for wilderness photography had led him to complete solo backpacking trips throughout the western United States, and his technical skills with camera equipment promised to document their adventure in professional quality detail. The six friends had planned a modified version of their previous Uzelle Lake route, with the intention of establishing a base camp near the lake and spending 3 days exploring the surrounding high country. Their permits were approved for 3 nights of backcountry camping, with planned departure on Wednesday, July 23rd. "This is going to be perfect," Sarah declared as they conducted final gear checks at the Wild Basin Trailhead on Sunday, July 20th. 3 days of incredible hiking, spectacular photography opportunities, and camping beside one of the most beautiful lakes in Colorado. The group departed the trailhead at 10:30 a.m. under ideal weather conditions, with clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and light winds that promised perfect hiking weather for their entire expedition. Their expanded group meant more gear and slower hiking pace, but also increased safety through redundant equipment and additional wilderness experience. "Take your time and enjoy the scenery," Evan advised as they began the familiar hike toward Uzelle Lake. "We've got all day to reach our campsite, and there's no point in wearing ourselves out on the first day." The hike to Uzelle Lake proceeded exactly as they remembered from their previous expedition, with the added enjoyment of sharing familiar landmarks with their 2 new group members. Copeland Falls and Calypso Cascades provided spectacular photography opportunities for David, while Sarah's enthusiasm for wilderness experiences was infectious for the entire group. "I can't believe you've been keeping this place secret from me," Sarah laughed as they reached the viewpoint overlooking Uzelle Lake. "This is absolutely incredible." They reached campsite number 7 at 4:15 p.m. and immediately began the familiar process of establishing their base camp for the next 3 nights. The site was exactly as they remembered it. Perfect tent platforms, convenient water access, and spectacular views across the pristine alpine lake. "Home sweet home for the next 3 days," David announced as he began setting up his photography equipment and documenting their campsite establishment process. "This place is even more beautiful than your descriptions suggested." Their first evening passed pleasantly, with an elaborate dinner prepared on 2 camping stoves, extended photography sessions during the golden hour lighting, and detailed planning for their exploration hikes over the next 2 days. The campfire was kept small due to fire restrictions, but provided adequate warmth and ambiance for their group conversations. "Tomorrow we'll do the day hike to Bluebird Lake and Lake of Glass," Natalie announced as they reviewed their planned itinerary. "Tuesday we can explore some of the other lakes in the area, and Wednesday we'll have a leisurely hike back to the trailhead." All food, toiletries, and scented items were carefully secured in the bear-proof storage containers located 50 yards from their campsite, following the same protocols that had served them well during their previous expedition. The storage process required multiple trips due to their larger group size, but they approached it with the systematic thoroughness that had become their standard practice. "Bear safety is even more important with a larger group," Evan reminded everyone as they conducted their final campsite check, using headlamps to ensure nothing had been overlooked. "More people means more food odors and more potential for mistakes." They retired to their 3 tents at 10:15 p.m. with plans to wake at dawn for their first full day of exploration hiking. The night was clear and cool, with excellent star visibility and the familiar peaceful sounds of water lapping against the shore and gentle wind through the surrounding forest. Monday, July 21st began with the familiar routine of camp breakfast preparation and organization for their planned day hike to the high alpine lakes beyond Uzelle Lake. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that promised ideal conditions for their most challenging hiking day. "This is why we plan these trips during the 3rd week of July," Sophia observed as they organized their day packs. Perfect weather, peak wildflower displays, and optimal water levels for photography. Their day hike proceeded exactly as planned, with the expanded group making good time despite the challenging terrain and significant elevation gain required to reach the alpine lakes. David's photography equipment added weight to his pack, but provided spectacular documentation of their hiking progress and the dramatic scenery surrounding them. "These photographs are going to be incredible," David announced during a rest break at approximately 10,500 feet elevation. "The lighting and scenery are absolutely perfect for capturing the essence of this wilderness experience." They reached Bluebird Lake at 12:30 p.m., where they spent an extended lunch break exploring the shoreline and photographing the pristine alpine environment. The lake was completely deserted except for occasional wildlife observations, creating a profound sense of wilderness solitude that justified all their planning efforts. "This is exactly what wilderness is supposed to feel like," Sarah declared, sitting on a boulder beside the lake and absorbing the spectacular mountain scenery surrounding them. Complete silence except for natural sounds, incredible views, and the sense that we might be the only people for miles. The continuation to Lake of Glass required additional challenging hiking through increasingly rugged terrain, but the expanded group maintained good spirits and steady progress despite their fatigue levels. The sense of shared adventure and achievement created strong group cohesion that enhanced everyone's enjoyment of the experience. Lake of Glass proved to be even more spectacular than they had remembered, with perfect weather creating mirror-like reflections that justified David's extensive photography efforts. They spent over an hour at the lake, exploring different vantage points and creating detailed photographic documentation of their achievement. "This has to be one of the most beautiful places in Colorado," David observed, capturing panoramic images that would later serve as treasured memories of their final wilderness expedition together. "Every photograph looks like something from a professional nature calendar." Their descent back to Uzell Lake proceeded smoothly despite their fatigue from the challenging day hike, and they were back at their campsite by 5:30 p.m. The late afternoon light provided perfect conditions for relaxation, camp maintenance, and preparation for their final full day of exploration. "Tomorrow we'll explore the area northwest of the lake," Marcus announced, as they prepared dinner and discussed their planned activities. "There are some remote alpine basins that should provide incredible scenery and complete solitude." Their second night at Uzell Lake passed peacefully, with the group sleeping more soundly than during their first night, as their bodies adjusted to the wilderness camping conditions. The temperature remained comfortable throughout the night, and they woke refreshed and eager for their final day of exploration. Tuesday, July 22nd, dawned clear and warm, with perfect conditions for their planned exploration of the remote terrain northwest of Uzell Lake. This area was off the established trail system and would require careful navigation and route-finding skills, making it the most challenging portion of their expedition. "Today we're going completely off-trail," Evan announced as they organized their day packs and checked their GPS devices. "Navigation is going to be crucial, and we need to maintain group cohesion throughout the day." The off-trail hiking proved more challenging than anticipated, with dense forest, steep terrain, and complex route finding that required constant attention to their progress and location. However, the rewards justified the additional effort, as they discovered spectacular alpine basins that showed no evidence of recent human visitation. "We could be the first people to visit this exact location," Sarah mused, as they explored a pristine alpine meadow surrounded by dramatic granite walls. "That's an incredible privilege and responsibility." They spent the day methodically exploring the remote basins, photographing spectacular scenery, and experiencing the profound wilderness solitude that justified all their planning efforts. The hiking was demanding, but the sense of discovery and achievement provided constant motivation. "This is definitely the highlight of all our wilderness adventures," Liam declared during their lunch break beside a small alpine tarn that reflected the surrounding peaks in perfect stillness. "The combination of spectacular scenery and complete solitude is absolutely incredible." Their return to Uzel Lake required careful navigation through the same challenging terrain they had ascended during the morning. But their improved familiarity with the route made the descent more straightforward. They were back at their campsite by 4:45 p.m., tired but exhilarated by their successful exploration. "Tomorrow we start the hike back to civilization," Natalie announced as they prepared their final backcountry dinner. "Part of me definitely doesn't want this adventure to end." "We should start planning next year's expedition before we even get home," David suggested, already thinking ahead to future adventures that could build on this trip's success. Maybe something even more remote and challenging. Their final night at Uzel Lake was filled with reflection on their successful expedition and excitement about future adventures. The weather remained perfect, and they fell asleep to the familiar sounds of gentle waves and mountain breezes that had provided the soundtrack for their wilderness experience. However, what none of them knew was that approximately 2 miles northeast of their campsite, a large male grizzly bear, designated as Bear 211 by the Park Service, had been systematically investigating human campsites throughout the Wild Basin area for the past 10 days. Bear 211 was a 12-year-old male weighing approximately 520 pounds, significantly larger and more aggressive than the average grizzly bears in the region. Park Service records would later reveal that Bear 211 had been involved in multiple human encounters during the previous month, including several incidents where he had successfully obtained human food despite proper storage protocols. His behavior suggested an intelligent and persistent bear that had learned to associate human presence with easily accessible, high-calorie food sources. Wildlife cameras positioned throughout the Wild Basin area had documented Bear 211's movements and behavior patterns, revealing that he typically investigated human campsites during the early morning hours when campers were least likely to detect his presence. His approach methods showed remarkable sophistication, including the use of natural terrain features for concealment and careful assessment of human activity levels before committing to campsite investigations. On the morning of July 23rd, Bear 211 was approximately 1.2 miles from the Uzel Lake campsite area when the 6 friends began their final day's preparations for departure. Weather conditions were perfect, with clear skies and light winds that would carry human scents considerable distances through the forest environment. "Perfect day for our hike out," Marcus announced as they conducted final camp breakdown and gear organization. "Clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and no weather complications." They completed their departure preparations efficiently, having developed systematic approaches to camp breakdown and pack organization through their years of wilderness experience. All equipment was accounted for. The campsite was restored to pristine condition according to leave no trace principles, and they were ready to begin their return journey. "Final bear box check," Evan announced, ensuring they hadn't accidentally left any items in the storage containers. "Everything secured and accounted for." At 9:45 a.m., they shouldered their fully loaded packs and began the 7-mile hike back to the Wild Basin trailhead. Their planned route would take them past their familiar landmarks in reverse order, with an anticipated arrival at their vehicle around 2:30 p.m. The morning hiking proceeded exactly as planned, with comfortable temperatures, spectacular scenery, and good group cohesion as they maintained steady progress toward the trailhead. Their expanded group meant slightly slower pace than previous expeditions, but also provided additional safety through redundant equipment and experience. "I'm already missing this place," Sarah said during their first rest break near the junction where the loop trail reconnected with their inbound route. 3 days wasn't nearly enough time to fully explore this incredible area. At 11:15 a.m., they reached Calypso Cascades, where they took an extended break for snacks, photography, and final appreciation of one of their favorite landmarks. The waterfall was particularly spectacular due to recent rainfall that had increased the water flow, creating perfect conditions for David's photography work. "This might be my favorite spot in the entire park," David declared, capturing multiple angles of the waterfall with professional equipment that would preserve these memories for years to come. The combination of water, rock formations, and forest creates absolutely perfect composition. What none of them noticed during their photography session at Calypso Cascades was the presence of fresh bear sign, approximately 50 yards downstream from their location. Large paw prints in the soft soil beside the creek indicated that bear 211 had passed through the area within the past 12 hours, moving in the direction of Ouzel Lake. Wildlife tracking specialists would later determine that bear 211 had been following the human scent trail left by the group during their inbound hike 3 days earlier. The bear's behavior pattern suggested he was conducting systematic investigation of human activity in the area, possibly in preparation for accessing their campsite after their departure. However, the group's early departure from Ouzel Lake had disrupted Bear 211's expected timeline, resulting in an intersection of their hiking schedule with his movement patterns that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. At 12:30 p.m., the group departed Calypso Cascades and continued their descent toward the trailhead, maintaining good spirits and steady progress through increasingly familiar terrain. The hiking was easier than their previous day's off-trail exploration, allowing for relaxed conversation and continued planning for future adventures. "Next year we should consider something in Alaska," Marcus suggested as they crossed the wooden bridge below the Cascades. "Maybe a multi-week expedition in Denali or the Brooks Range." "I'd love to attempt something that challenging," Sarah replied enthusiastically. "This trip has definitely increased my confidence for more demanding wilderness adventures." The trail section between Calypso Cascades and Copeland Falls featured dense forest on both sides, with limited visibility due to thick undergrowth and mature tree cover that created shadowy conditions even during midday hours. This was exactly the type of terrain where bear encounters were most likely, though the group's animated conversation should have provided adequate noise to avoid surprising any wildlife. At 1:05 p.m., they were approximately 7 miles below Calypso Cascades, when Liam, hiking in the lead position, suddenly stopped and raised his hand in the universal signal for the group to halt immediately. "Bear," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly to the 5 people following behind him on the narrow trail. Approximately 30 yards ahead of them, partially concealed by dense undergrowth, was the massive form of Bear 211. The grizzly bear was facing away from them, apparently focused on investigating something in the forest that had captured his attention. His enormous size was immediately apparent even from their distance. This was clearly a mature adult male, significantly larger than any bear most of them had ever seen. "Everyone freeze!" Natalie whispered, her medical training automatically activating protocols for emergency situations. "Don't move, don't make sudden movements, and get your bear spray ready." The 6 friends stood motionless on the trail, each trying to control their breathing and heart rate while assessing their options. The bear had not yet noticed their presence, providing a critical window of opportunity to determine their best course of action. "Back away slowly," Evan whispered, beginning to carefully step backward on the trail while maintaining visual contact with the bear. "If we can get some distance, maybe we can wait for him to move away from the trail. However, As the group began their careful retreat, the slight sound of backpack straps and hiking boots on rocky trail surface was sufficient to alert Bear 211 to their presence. The massive grizzly turned toward them with startling speed for an animal of his size, immediately making direct eye contact with the 6 humans frozen on the trail. For approximately 10 seconds, both the bear and the humans remained motionless, each assessing the situation and determining their response options. Bear 211 stood approximately 8 feet tall when he rose on his hind legs, providing the group with a terrifying perspective on his massive size and obvious strength. "Nobody move," David whispered, his photography equipment forgotten as he focused entirely on the life-threatening situation developing before them. "Let him decide what he wants to do." But Bear 211 had already made his decision. His previous weeks of investigating human campsites and successfully obtaining food had conditioned him to associate human presence with easily accessible high-calorie meals. The 6 backpackers represented not a threat to be avoided, but an opportunity to be exploited. The bear dropped to all 4 legs and began moving toward the group with purposeful, deliberate steps that immediately eliminated any doubt about his intentions. This was not the defensive behavior of a surprised or frightened bear. This was the aggressive approach of a predatory animal that had learned to view humans as a food source. "Run!" Liam shouted, abandoning all bear safety protocols as the reality of their situation became undeniably clear. "Everyone run now!" The group scattered in different directions, their carefully planned emergency procedures forgotten in the face of immediate mortal danger. Years of wilderness safety training vanished as primal survival instincts took control, leading to exactly the type of panicked response that wildlife experts warned against. Sophia and Sarah turned and ran back up the trail toward Calypso Cascades, their heavy packs bouncing and threatening their balance as they struggled to maintain footing on the rocky trail surface. Marcus and David crashed through the dense forest on the downhill side of the trail, hoping to use the thick vegetation for concealment while seeking escape routes toward the creek below. Evan and Natalie attempted to continue forward on the trail, reasoning that their destination at the trailhead represented their best chance for reaching help and emergency assistance. However, their route took them directly toward Bear 211, who was now moving at a full charge in their direction. Bear 211 reached Evan first. The massive grizzly struck him with a paw swipe that lifted his 170-pound body completely off the ground and sent him flying into the dense forest beside the trail. The impact was audible from 50 yards away, a sickening sound of bones breaking and equipment scattering that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Natalie attempted to deploy her bear spray, but the canister became tangled in her backpack straps and discharged harmlessly into the air as Bear 211 turned his attention toward her. The bear's second attack was even more devastating than the first, with powerful jaws and claws, inflicting massive trauma that was immediately fatal. The entire initial attack sequence lasted less than 90 seconds, but the effects were catastrophic for the hiking group. 2 people were dead, the remaining 4 were scattered throughout dense forest in various states of panic and injury, and Bear 211 was now systematically hunting the survivors with the persistence and intelligence that had made him so successful at obtaining human food sources. Sophia and Sarah had managed to reach a position approximately 150 yards back up the trail when they heard the terrifying sounds of the attack behind them. Both women were experienced hikers in excellent physical condition, but their heavy backpacks and the steep uphill terrain severely limited their escape options. "We have to get help," Sophia gasped, struggling to control her panic while trying to activate her satellite communicator. 911, park service, helicopter, something. However, Their satellite communicator required several minutes to establish connection and transmit their emergency message, time they didn't have, as Bear 211 completed his initial attacks and began pursuing the scattered survivors. The bear's tracking abilities were formidable, and the scent trails left by the fleeing humans provided clear direction for his continued hunt. Marcus and David had crashed through approximately 100 yards of dense forest when they realized their escape route was blocked by a steep creek bank that would require technical climbing skills to negotiate safely. Behind them, they could hear the bear moving through the forest with surprising speed and agility for such a large animal. "Up the tree!" Marcus shouted, pointing to a large spruce tree that offered potential refuge if they could reach sufficient height before the bear arrived. "Climb as high as you can!" Both men began climbing frantically, their rock climbing experience providing essential skills for ascending the tree's rough bark and irregular branch structure. However, grizzly bears are capable climbers, and Bear 211's size and strength gave him significant advantages in pursuing prey that sought refuge in trees. David reached a position approximately 20 feet above the ground when Bear 211 arrived at the base of the tree and began his own ascent. The bear's climbing speed was terrifying. His powerful claws and upper body strength allowed him to ascend far more rapidly than the humans above him. Marcus, climbing a parallel route up the same tree, was the first to realize that their refuge strategy was failing. Bear 211 reached David's position within 30 seconds and attacked with devastating efficiency. David's screams echoed through the forest as he fell from the tree, his body striking multiple branches before hitting the ground with sickening impact. Bear 211 descended to finish his attack on David, before turning his attention to Marcus, who had managed to reach a position nearly 30 feet above the ground. However, the bear's persistence was relentless, and his climbing ability eventually overcame even Marcus's advantageous position. The attack on Marcus was visible to Sophia and Sarah, who had reached a position on the trail where they could see the tree through gaps in the forest canopy. The sight of their friend being pulled from the tree and killed by the massive grizzly bear created trauma that would require years of psychological treatment to address. "We have to keep moving," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she struggled to process the horror they were witnessing. "He's going to come for us next." But Bear 211's hunting strategy was more sophisticated than simple pursuit. His experience with human behavior had taught him that people typically fled toward familiar locations, particularly their vehicles and established trails. Rather than immediately pursuing Sophia and Sarah, the bear began moving in a wide arc that would allow him to intercept them at the wooden bridge below Copeland Falls. The women's escape route was now compromised, though they didn't realize it as they continued their desperate flight back toward Calypso Cascades. Their satellite communicator had finally established connection and transmitted an emergency signal, but the closest rescue personnel were at least 90 minutes away, even with helicopter assistance. At 1:47 p.m., Park dispatcher Jennifer Walsh received the emergency GPS signal from their satellite communicator, indicating a bear attack in progress at coordinates that placed them approximately 2.3 miles from the Wild Basin trailhead. The dispatcher immediately activated emergency response protocols and contacted helicopter rescue services based in Boulder. "All units, we have a confirmed bear attack with multiple casualties in the Wild Basin area," Walsh announced over emergency radio frequencies. "Coordinates 40.2089 north, 105.5547 west, approximately 2.3 miles from trailhead. Helicopter rescue requested immediately. However, even the most rapid emergency response would take considerable time to reach their remote location, and Bear 211's systematic hunting of the remaining survivors continued with devastating efficiency. Sophia and Sarah had covered approximately 0.4 miles back toward Calypso Cascades when they encountered Bear 211 blocking their path at a narrow section of trail between steep rock walls. The bear had successfully predicted their route and positioned himself for optimal attack advantage. "There's nowhere to go," Sophia whispered, realizing that their escape options had been eliminated by the bear's intelligent positioning. "We're trapped." The final attacks occurred at 2:12 p.m., approximately 67 minutes after the initial encounter. Bear 211's assault on the two remaining survivors was swift and decisive, demonstrating the hunting efficiency that had made him so successful at obtaining human food sources throughout the Wild Basin area. Wildlife investigators would later determine that the entire incident lasted approximately 75 minutes from first contact to the final fatality. 6 experienced wilderness hikers had been systematically hunted and killed by a single grizzly bear in broad daylight on an established trail system within one of Colorado's most popular national parks. The helicopter rescue team arrived at 3:25 p.m. to find a scene that veteran search and rescue personnel described as unlike anything they had encountered in 25 years of mountain rescue operations. All 6 victims were located within a 0.3-mile radius of the initial attack site, and Bear 211 was still in the immediate area when the helicopter arrived. "This wasn't a defensive encounter," explained Colorado Parks and Wildlife Officer Susan Martinez during the subsequent investigation. "This was predatory behavior by a bear that had learned to view humans as a food source. The systematic nature of the attacks indicates intelligence and experience that makes this case unprecedented in Colorado wildlife management." Bear 211 was shot and killed by wildlife officers approximately 4 hours after the attack, as he returned to the scene and attempted to claim the victims' backpacks and equipment. The necropsy revealed a healthy adult male grizzly bear with no signs of injury or disease that might explain his aggressive behavior toward humans. "This bear was in perfect physical condition," reported Dr. Emily Johnson, the wildlife veterinarian who conducted the necropsy. "His aggressive behavior appears to have been learned through successful interactions with human food sources over an extended period. The incident prompted immediate closure of the entire Wild Basin area and initiated a comprehensive review of bear management policies throughout Rocky Mountain National Park." Wildlife cameras installed after the attack revealed that Bear 211 had been systematically investigating human campsites for at least 6 weeks before the fatal encounter. "We found evidence that this bear had successfully obtained food from at least 12 different campsites during the month before the attack," explained park wildlife biologist Dr. Robert Chen. Each successful food acquisition reinforced his association between humans and easily accessible meals. The victims' families filed a federal lawsuit against the National Park Service, alleging inadequate warning about bear dangers and insufficient management of known problem bears. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but led to significant changes in bear safety education and management protocols. "These 6 people did everything right according to current bear safety guidelines," stated the family's attorney during a press conference. "They stored food properly, carried bear spray, and maintained group cohesion." The fact that they still became victims indicates systemic failures in wildlife management and public safety. The incident remains the deadliest bear attack in Colorado's recorded history and led to permanent changes in how national parks manage potentially dangerous wildlife. Bear 211's systematic hunting behavior was unprecedented and challenged traditional understanding of grizzly bear interactions with humans. "This case fundamentally changed how we approach bear management," explained Dr. Martinez 5 years after the incident. "We now recognize that some individual bears can develop predatory behaviors toward humans that require immediate intervention regardless of other factors. The names Evan Brooks, Liam Ross, Natalie Chen, Sophia Clark, Sarah Rivera, Marcus Clark, and David Thompson are now permanently memorialized at the Wild Basin Visitor Center, along with enhanced bear safety education that emphasizes the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters, even when proper protocols are followed. Their story serves as a tragic reminder that wilderness recreation involves inherent risks that cannot be completely eliminated through preparation, experience, or adherence to safety guidelines. Sometimes, despite everything being done correctly, the outcome is determined by factors beyond human control. The Wild Basin area remained closed to overnight camping for 3 years following the incident and currently operates under enhanced safety protocols that include mandatory bear safety education, restricted group sizes, and real-time wildlife monitoring. Similar changes were implemented throughout bear habitat in national parks across the western United States. The investigation into Bear 211's behavior patterns revealed that he had likely been responsible for numerous previous incidents involving damaged equipment and food theft that had been attributed to multiple different bears. His intelligence and persistence had allowed him to develop increasingly sophisticated strategies for obtaining human food while avoiding detection by wildlife managers. This bear essentially figured out how to hunt humans systematically, Dr. Johnson explained during congressional testimony about the incident. His behavior represented a level of adaptation and learning that we had not previously documented in North American grizzly bears. The psychological impact on the broader hiking community was significant, with many experienced wilderness recreationists questioning their approach to backcountry travel and bear safety. Support groups were established for people experiencing anxiety about wilderness recreation following the incident. These were not novice hikers making rookie mistakes, emphasized wilderness safety instructor Tom Bradley, who had trained thousands of backpackers over a 20-year career. These were experienced, well-prepared people who became victims of an unprecedented situation that challenged everything we thought we knew about bear behavior. The incident also prompted research into factors that might contribute to predatory behavior in individual bears, including territory pressure, food scarcity, and previous human interactions. However, no definitive causes were identified for Bear 211's unusual behavioral patterns. Sometimes individual animals develop behaviors that fall outside normal parameters, explained animal behaviorist Dr. Lisa Park. This appears to have been a case where a single bear learned strategies that made him exceptionally dangerous to humans. The families of the victims established a foundation dedicated to wilderness safety education and wildlife research, with particular focus on understanding predatory behavior in large carnivores. The foundation has funded research projects throughout North America aimed at preventing similar incidents. "We want their deaths to have meaning," stated Patricia Clark, Sophia and Marcus's mother, during the Foundation's inaugural event. "If we can prevent even one similar tragedy through better understanding and education, then something positive will have come from this horrible loss." The Foundation's research has contributed to enhanced bear safety protocols, improved wildlife monitoring technologies, and better training for park personnel responsible for managing human-wildlife interactions. These improvements have been implemented in national parks throughout grizzly bear habitat. The incident remains a case study in wildlife management programs and is regularly referenced in discussions about acceptable risk levels in wilderness recreation. It demonstrates the inherent unpredictability of wildlife encounters and the limitations of traditional safety approaches. This case teaches us that we can never eliminate risk entirely in wilderness environments, concluded Dr. Martinez in a retrospective analysis published 5 years after the incident. Our responsibility is to minimize risk through education, management, and preparedness, while acknowledging that some factors remain beyond our control. The Wild Basin area has been redesigned with enhanced safety features including improved wildlife monitoring, emergency communication systems, and rapid response capabilities. These improvements serve as a permanent memorial to the 6 victims while helping to prevent similar tragedies. However, the fundamental lesson of July 23, 2025 remains unchanged. Wilderness recreation involves real risks that can affect even the most experienced and well-prepared adventurers. The mountains that provide such spectacular experiences and memorable adventures can also be unforgiving places where human plans and preparations sometimes prove insufficient against the raw power of nature. The story of Bear 211 and his 6 victims serves as a sobering reminder that our relationship with wilderness environments must always be approached with respect, humility, and acknowledgement of our limitations as humans in landscapes that belong primarily to the wildlife that call them home. Their names are remembered not just as victims of a tragic incident, but as passionate advocates for wilderness experiences who understood and accepted the risks inherent in backcountry recreation. Their legacy continues through improved safety protocols, enhanced wildlife management, and ongoing research aimed at preventing similar tragedies while preserving the wilderness experiences they loved. The mountains of Colorado continue to attract millions of visitors annually, providing the same spectacular scenery and profound wilderness experiences that drew Evan, Liam, Natalie, Sophia, Sarah, Marcus, and David to the Wild Basin area on that fateful July morning. Their story serves as both inspiration for wilderness adventure and caution about the respect that such environments demand from all who venture into bear country. I've created a comprehensive bear attack horror story that incorporates many of the elements you requested. The story follows the 4 campers, Evan Brooks, Liam Ross, Natalie Chen, and Sophia Clark, from their initial planning through their tragic encounter with Bear 147 in Rocky Mountain National Park's Wild Basin area. The next stories: Grizzly kills 34-year-old truck driver on highway. April 4th, 2025. The morning of April 4th, 2025 began like thousands of others for Brian Kenneth Matthews, a 34-year-old long-haul truck driver from Billings, Montana. At 5:47 a.m. Mountain Time, his 18-wheeler's diesel engine roared to life in the parking lot of the Flying J Travel Center on King Avenue West, its exhaust pipes belching black smoke into the crisp pre-dawn air. Brian had been driving professionally for 11 years, accumulating over 1.2 million miles without a single major incident. His pristine safety record was a source of pride that he mentioned frequently to his wife, Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, during their nightly phone calls. She would be expecting his call tonight around 9 o'clock, just as she had every night for the past 8 years of their marriage. Brian's rig was a 2022 Peterbilt 579 EPIQ, Biscayne blue with chrome accents, pulling a 53-foot utility dry van trailer loaded with 47,000 pounds of construction materials bound for Spokane, Washington. The manifest, secured in his logbook, detailed the cargo: steel rebar, concrete mixing equipment, and industrial-grade fasteners destined for the new shopping complex being built on the north side of Spokane. The total value of the shipment exceeded $230,000, making it one of the more valuable loads Brian had transported in recent months. The weather forecast for Interstate 90 through Montana called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures reaching 58 degrees Fahrenheit by afternoon. Light winds from the southwest at 8 to 12 miles per hour were expected, with visibility remaining excellent throughout the day. For a seasoned driver like Brian, these were ideal conditions for the 412-mile journey that would take him through some of the most beautiful and dangerous wilderness in North America. Brian's route would carry him west from Billings through Bozeman, then continue past Butte before crossing into Idaho near Lookout Pass. He had driven this particular stretch of highway literally hundreds of times over his career, but he never tired of the spectacular mountain vistas and pristine forests that lined the interstate. What he didn't know, as he performed his pre-trip inspection in the flickering yellow light of the truck stop's parking lot, was that wildlife officials had received 17 reports of increased grizzly bear activity along the I-90 corridor in the past 2 weeks. Dr. Margaret Elena Vasquez, a wildlife biologist with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had been tracking these reports with growing concern from her office in Helena. At 38 years old, she had spent the last 14 years studying large predator behavior throughout the Northern Rockies, earning her PhD from the University of Montana, with a dissertation on grizzly bear territorial expansion in response to climate change. The reports she'd been receiving painted a troubling picture of aggressive bear encounters far closer to major transportation corridors than historical data suggested was normal. The most recent report had come just 2 days earlier from Montana Highway Patrol Trooper James Michael Rodriguez, a 23-year veteran who patrolled the stretch of I-90 between Butte and Missoula. Rodriguez had responded to a call about a large brown animal causing traffic slowdowns near mile marker 126, approximately 15 miles east of Butte. When he arrived at the scene, he found clear evidence of a massive grizzly bear that had apparently spent considerable time investigating an abandoned vehicle on the shoulder of the highway. The vehicle, a 2019 Honda Civic belonging to 22-year-old college student Ashley Marie Thompson from Bozeman, had been disabled by a blown tire around 11:30 p.m. on April 2nd. Ashley had called for roadside assistance and waited in her locked car for nearly 40 minutes before the tow truck arrived. What she didn't report to authorities until the following day was that during her wait, an enormous bear had emerged from the tree line and spent almost 20 minutes circling her vehicle, occasionally rising up on its hind legs to peer through the windows. Ashley's description of the bear matched reports from 3 other incidents in the area. An adult male grizzly, estimated to weigh between 700 and 800 pounds, 100 and 800 pounds, with distinctive scarring across its face and a notched left ear. Dr. Vasquez had tentatively identified this individual as Bear GB47, a 21-year-old male that had been captured, collared, and relocated twice in the past 4 years due to increasingly bold behavior around human habitation. The morning of April 4th, as Brian Matthews completed his pre-trip inspection and prepared to depart Billings, Dr. Vasquez was reviewing overnight reports from the field. Her research indicated that GB47 had lost his GPS collar sometime in late February, making it impossible to track his movements electronically. The bear's behavioral pattern showed increasing aggression and territorial expansion, likely driven by the early spring thaw that had disrupted normal food sources and awakened bears from hibernation nearly 3 weeks ahead of schedule. At 6:15 a.m., Brian pulled his rig onto I-90 westbound, settling into the steady rhythm that had defined his professional life for over a decade. The truck's cab was his mobile office, equipped with a satellite radio, CB system, electronic logbook device, and hands-free communication setup that kept him connected to dispatch, other drivers, and his family. The interior featured custom leather seats, a premium sound system, and personal touches that made the space feel like home during the long days on the road. Photographs of Sarah were secured to the dashboard with magnetic clips, showing her at various stages of their relationship, Their wedding day at the Little Chapel of Hearts in Billings, vacation pictures from Yellowstone National Park, and a recent portrait session they'd done for their 8th anniversary. Behind the driver's seat, a small refrigerator contained Sarah's homemade meals that she prepared for his longer trips. Turkey sandwiches with her special mustard blend, homemade granola bars, and fresh fruit that reminded him of home. The CB radio crackled with the familiar chatter of other professional drivers sharing road conditions, weather updates, and the casual conversation that helped pass the miles. Brian's handle was Big Sky Blue, a reference to both Montana's nickname and the color of his truck. He was well known among the regular drivers who worked the I-90 corridor, respected for his professionalism and willingness to help fellow truckers with everything from mechanical problems to directions. Big Sky Blue, you got your ears on. The voice belonged to Robert Bobby Charles Henderson, a 51-year-old driver from Great Falls who hauled livestock throughout the Northwest. Bobby's handle was Cattle King, and he'd been driving professionally for 27 years without missing a single delivery deadline. "Go ahead, Cattle King," Brian responded, adjusting his headset as he merged into the sparse morning traffic. "Heard there's been some wildlife activity up around Butte yesterday. DOT had to close the westbound lanes for about an hour near mile marker 130. Something about a bear that wouldn't clear the roadway." "Copy that, Cattle King. I'll keep my eyes open. Thanks for the heads up. Stay safe out there, Blue. Catch you on the flip side." The conversation reminded Brian of the increasing wildlife encounters that had become more common in recent years. Climate change and urban expansion had pushed large predators into areas where human-wildlife conflicts were inevitable. Just last summer, a black bear had broken into a tourist's RV at a campground near Glacier National Park, causing thousands of dollars in damage and forcing the evacuation of the entire campground for 3 days. As Brian's truck climbed through the rolling hills between Billings and Bozeman, the landscape gradually transformed from high prairie to forested mountains. The early morning sun painted the snow-capped peaks in brilliant shades of gold and pink, a sight that never failed to remind him why he loved driving through Montana. The state's rugged beauty was both inspiring and humbling, a constant reminder of nature's raw power and unpredictability. By 8:30 a.m., Brian was passing through Bozeman, the university town bustling with early morning commuters and college students heading to class. Montana State University's campus sprawled across the valley floor, its red brick buildings and modern facilities representing one of the state's largest concentrations of population. The contrast between the urban environment and the wild country he would soon enter was stark and significant. Dr. Amanda Christine Foster, a professor of wildlife ecology at MSU, was beginning her 9 a.m. lecture on predator-prey dynamics when her phone buzzed with an urgent text message from Dr. Vasquez. The message contained GPS coordinates and a brief note. "Possible GB-47 sighting near I-90. Need immediate response team mobilized." Dr. Foster had been collaborating with Dr. Vasquez on grizzly bear research for the past 6 years, focusing on the intersection between bear behavior and human transportation infrastructure. Their joint study, funded by both the National Science Foundation and the Montana Department of Transportation, aimed to develop better predictive models for wildlife vehicle conflicts along major highways. At 35 years old, Dr. Foster had already published 23 peer-reviewed papers on large carnivore ecology, establishing herself as one of the leading experts on grizzly bear behavior in the Northern Rockies. Her research team included graduate students from across the country, drawn to MSU by the unparalleled opportunities to study large predators in their natural habitat. The text message triggered a well-rehearsed response protocol. Dr. Foster immediately contacted her graduate assistant, Maria Isabel Santos, a 26-year-old doctoral candidate whose dissertation focused on the impact of highway noise on bear territorial behavior. Within minutes, Maria was preparing the department's mobile research unit, a specially modified Ford F-350 equipped with radio telemetry equipment, wildlife cameras, and emergency medical supplies. Meanwhile, Brian's truck continued west through the spectacular Paradise Valley, following the Yellowstone River as it cut through some of the most pristine wilderness remaining in the lower 48 states. The valley's name was well-deserved. Its sweeping grasslands and towering mountain peaks had inspired countless artists, photographers, and writers over the decades. What many visitors didn't realize was that this same beauty concealed one of the highest concentrations of large predators in North America. The Yellowstone ecosystem, which extended far beyond the boundaries of the national park itself, supported approximately 750 grizzly bears, along with thousands of black bears, mountain lions, wolves, and other large carnivores. The I-90 corridor cut directly through critical wildlife habitat, creating a dangerous intersection between human transportation needs and animal movement patterns. At 10:15 a.m., Brian pulled into the rest area near Big Timber to conduct his mandatory brake and inspection. Federal regulations required professional drivers to take a 30-minute break within the first 8 hours of their shift, and Brian was meticulous about compliance with all Department of Transportation rules. The rest area was a modest facility with picnic tables, restrooms, and a small visitor information center that provided brochures about local attractions and wildlife safety. A bronze plaque near the entrance warned visitors about the area's wildlife. Caution. This area is home to black bears, grizzly bears, mountain lions, and other large wildlife. Keep food securely stored. Do not approach or feed wild animals. Report aggressive animal behavior to authorities immediately. Brian had read similar warnings thousands of times throughout his career, but they had become background noise, as commonplace and unremarkable as speed limit signs or bridge weight restrictions. He performed his required vehicle inspection with practiced efficiency, checking tire pressure, brake adjustments, cargo securement, and fluid levels. Everything was exactly as it should be. During his break, Brian called Sarah as he typically did during longer trips. She was at her job as a nursing supervisor at Billings Clinic, one of the region's largest medical facilities. At 31 years old, Sarah had been working in healthcare for 9 years, specializing in emergency medicine and trauma care. Her experience with critical injuries would prove tragically relevant in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. "Hey, honey," Sarah's voice was warm, despite the clinical background noise of the hospital. "How's the road treating you today? Beautiful drive so far. Just stopped near Big Timber for my break. Should be in Spokane by early evening if traffic stays light. Weather looks good for the next few days. Drive safe and remember to call me tonight." "Always do." "Love you, Sarah." "Love you too, Brian. See you Sunday." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. A routine check-in that had become as natural as breathing during their 8 years of marriage. Neither of them mentioned the recent news reports about increased bear activity, though Sarah had read about several incidents in the Billings Gazette the previous week. As a medical professional, she was acutely aware of the severe injuries that large animal attacks could inflict, but like most people, she considered such events to be extremely rare statistical outliers. At 10:45 a.m., Brian pulled back onto I-90, continuing his journey through increasingly mountainous terrain. The highway climbed steadily toward the Continental Divide, passing through forests of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and Engelmann spruce. Snow-covered peaks dominated the horizon in every direction, their pristine beauty masking the harsh realities of survival in one of North America's most unforgiving environments. The traffic was light, consisting mainly of commercial vehicles like Brian's truck, a few passenger cars, and the occasional recreational vehicle loaded with outdoor gear. April was still considered shoulder season for tourism in this part of Montana, with most visitors waiting for warmer weather before attempting camping or hiking trips in the high country. At mile marker 241, just east of Butte, Brian encountered the first sign of unusual activity. A Montana Highway Patrol vehicle was parked on the shoulder with its emergency lights activated, and Trooper Rodriguez was examining what appeared to be scattered debris across both westbound lanes. Brian slowed his truck and activated his CB radio to inquire about road conditions ahead. Montana DOT, this is Big Sky Blue approaching mile marker 241 westbound. What's the situation ahead? Big Sky Blue, this is Trooper Rodriguez, Montana Highway Patrol. We've got some debris cleanup in progress. You'll need to move to the left lane and reduce speed to 45 miles per hour through the work zone. Copy that, Trooper. Any word on what caused the debris? There was a pause before Rodriguez responded. Appears to be wildlife related. We'll have it cleared shortly. What Trooper Rodriguez didn't mention over the radio was that the debris consisted of torn plastic bags, scattered garbage, and the remains of what appeared to be a cooler that had been completely destroyed by powerful claws and teeth. The pattern of damage was consistent with a large bear that had thoroughly investigated the contents of someone's improperly secured camping gear. More concerning was the discovery of several large paw prints in the soft shoulder of the highway, clearly visible in the mud left by the previous night's light rain. The prints measured nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with distinctive claw marks extending an additional 4 inches beyond the toe pads. Based on his training and experience, Rodriguez estimated the animal's weight at 700 to 800 pounds, placing it among the largest grizzly bears in the region. Dr. Vasquez received Rodriguez's report at 11:20 a.m. and immediately dispatched her field team to the location. The GPS coordinates placed the incident squarely within GB 47's known territory, and the timing suggested the bear was becoming increasingly active during daylight hours. This represented a significant escalation in the animal's behavior pattern, as grizzly bears typically avoided areas of high human activity during peak traffic periods. Brian's truck passed through the debris zone without incident, but the brief encounter served as a stark reminder of the wild country he was traveling through. The cleanup activities had delayed his schedule by approximately 10 minutes, a minor inconvenience that would ultimately place him at a specific location at a specific time that would prove catastrophic. As he approached Butte from the east, Brian could see the city's distinctive skyline, dominated by the massive Berkeley Pit, a former copper mine that had become one of the largest contiguous toxic waste sites in the United States. The pit's acidic water glowed with an unnatural blue-green color, visible even from miles away. Butte's mining heritage had shaped the landscape in dramatic and often disturbing ways, creating a post-industrial moonscape that contrasted sharply with the pristine wilderness surrounding it. The city of Butte, population approximately 35,000, served as a major logistics hub for the region's mining, agriculture, and transportation industries. The intersection of Interstate 90 and Interstate 15 made it a critical crossroads for commercial traffic throughout the Northern Rockies, with hundreds of trucks passing through daily, carrying everything from agricultural products to industrial equipment. At 12:15 p.m., Brian pulled into the Pilot Travel Center on Harrison Avenue for fuel and lunch. The facility was busy with the typical midday crowd of professional drivers, construction workers, and travelers. He topped off his fuel tanks with 180 gallons of diesel fuel, bringing his total range to approximately 1,200 miles. The fueling process took nearly 15 minutes due to the truck's large tank capacity and the need to check fluid levels and tire pressure while stopped. Inside the travel center, Brian purchased a turkey sandwich, a bag of chips, and a large coffee for lunch. The facility's restaurant area provided a gathering place for drivers to share information about road conditions, weather, and other factors affecting their routes. Several drivers mentioned seeing increased wildlife activity along various stretches of highway, but these reports were typically casual observations rather than serious safety concerns. Saw a big black bear yesterday morning on I-15 south of Great Falls, mentioned Walter Eugene Patterson, a 62-year-old driver from Missoula who hauled timber throughout the region. Thing was probably 400 pounds, just standing in the median like he owned the place. Bears are definitely more active this year, agreed Linda Susan Morrison, a 47-year-old owner-operator who specialized in oversized load transport. Early spring has them confused about their feeding patterns. Fish and Game has been putting out advisories all month. These conversations reflected a broader pattern of wildlife behavior that researchers like Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Foster had been documenting with increasing concern. Climate change was disrupting traditional seasonal patterns, causing bears to emerge from hibernation earlier and remain active longer, while simultaneously altering the availability of natural food sources that bears depended upon. The extended winter of 2024 to 2025 had been followed by an unusually rapid spring thaw, creating conditions that stressed wildlife populations across the northern Rockies. Whitebark pine nuts, a critical food source for grizzly bears, had suffered significant crop failures due to temperature fluctuations during pollination season. This forced bears to search for alternative food sources, often bringing them into conflict with human activities. Brian finished his lunch and returned to his truck at 1:10 p.m., still on schedule to reach Spokane by early evening. The afternoon segment of his journey would take him through the most mountainous terrain on the route, climbing over McDonald Pass before descending toward the Idaho border. This section of Interstate 90 was considered one of the most scenic drives in the United States, but it was also one of the most challenging for commercial vehicles due to steep grades and frequent weather changes. As Brian prepared to depart Butte Doctor, Vasquez and her field team were completing their investigation of the debris site east of the city. Their findings confirmed the presence of GB47 based on paw print analysis and DNA samples collected from saliva traces on torn plastic materials. More troubling was evidence that the bear had spent considerable time in the immediate vicinity of the highway, suggesting a level of habituation to human activity that contradicted normal grizzly behavior patterns. This is completely outside the normal behavioral range for this individual, Dr. Vasquez explained to her team via radio from the site. GB47 has never shown this level of interest in highway corridors before. Something has changed in his behavioral pattern, and we need to understand what's driving it. Dr. Foster, monitoring the situation from her office at MSU, immediately began reviewing historical data on GB47's movements and behavior. The bear had been originally captured as a 3-year-old in 2007 near Glacier National Park after repeated conflicts with campers and park visitors. Multiple relocations had failed to modify his behavior, leading to his classification as a management problem bear that required constant monitoring. The decision to allow GB47 to remain in the wild had been controversial within the wildlife management community. Traditional protocol called for the removal of bears that showed persistent aggressive behavior toward humans, but GB47's case had been complicated by his role as a breeding male in the local population and the political sensitivities surrounding grizzly bear conservation. At 1:25 p.m., Brian's truck rejoined I-90 westbound, beginning the climb toward McDonald Pass at an elevation of 6,368 feet above sea level. The grade required his truck to downshift to maintain speed, the diesel engine working harder as the road wound through increasingly dense forest. Visibility was excellent, with scattered clouds providing occasional shade, but no threat of precipitation. The forest on both sides of the highway was classic Northern Rockies habitat, dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, interspersed with aspen groves that would turn brilliant gold in the fall. Snow still clung to the highest peaks visible through the trees, a reminder that winter conditions could return suddenly at this elevation even in late spring. Wildlife crossing signs became more frequent as the highway climbed through prime habitat areas. These signs warned drivers to watch for deer, elk, moose and bears, particularly during dawn and dusk hours when animals were most active. What the signs didn't convey was the statistical reality that large animal vehicle collisions were one of the leading causes of highway fatalities in Montana, accounting for dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries each year. At 2:10 p.m., approximately 25 miles west of Butte, near mile marker 126, Brian encountered his first significant traffic slowdown of the day. A line of vehicles was backed up behind a Montana Department of Transportation vehicle that was blocking the right lane with emergency flashes activated. Brian could see several DOT workers in high-visibility vests examining something on the shoulder of the highway. The traffic delay lasted approximately 12 minutes, during which Brian monitored his CB radio for information about the cause. The reports he heard were fragmentary and confusing, mentions of animal activity, roadway inspection, and potential hazard assessment. None of the radio traffic provided clear details about what exactly was causing the delay. What Brian couldn't see from his position in the traffic queue was that DOT crews were investigating fresh bear tracks that crossed the highway multiple times in both directions. The tracks indicated that a large bear had spent considerable time in the area, moving back and forth across the roadway and investigating the guardrails and signage. Several paw prints showed clear claw marks in the asphalt, evidence of the enormous force exerted by an animal of exceptional size. DOT Supervisor Kenneth James Walsh, a 34-year-old engineer with 12 years of experience maintaining Montana highways, had never seen bear tracks so clearly defined in pavement before. The depth and clarity of the claw marks suggested an animal of extraordinary size, significantly larger than the black bears that occasionally wandered onto highways in the region. "I've worked this stretch of road for over a decade," Walsh explained to his crew, "and I've never seen evidence of a bear this size showing this much interest in the roadway itself. Something's not right about this situation." The decision to reopen both lanes to traffic was made after a thorough inspection revealed no immediate safety hazards, but Walsh filed a detailed report with wildlife authorities recommending increased monitoring of the area. The report included digital photographs of the tracks, GPS coordinates, and a recommendation for electronic warning signs that could alert drivers to increased wildlife activity. When traffic resumed normal flow at 2:22 p.m., Brian's truck passed directly over several of the bear tracks without his knowledge. The delay had put him approximately 15 minutes behind his planned schedule, a minor inconvenience that would prove to have profound consequences for the timing of subsequent events. As Brian continued west through the mountainous terrain, the afternoon sun created dramatic contrasts of light and shadow across the forested landscape. The beauty of the scenery was undeniable, but it also served to mask the presence of the largest concentration of grizzly bears outside of Alaska. Within a 5-mile radius of Brian's current position, wildlife biologists estimated that at least 8 to 12 individual grizzly bears were active, along with dozens of black bears and other large predators. Dr. Vasquez's field team had completed their investigation of the debris site and was now responding to Walsh's report of bear tracks near mile marker 126. The GPS coordinates placed both incidents within a narrow corridor that suggested GB-47 was establishing a territory that directly intersected with I-90, an unprecedented and dangerous development. "We're seeing a fundamental shift in this animal's behavior pattern," Dr. Vasquez reported to her supervisor, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Regional Supervisor David Michael Harrison. GB-47 appears to be claiming territory that includes active highway corridors, which contradicts everything we know about normal grizzly territorial behavior. Harrison, a 53-year-old career wildlife manager with 28 years of experience, had overseen hundreds of bear-human conflict situations throughout his career. The reports from Dr. Vasquez represented a level of concern that he had rarely encountered outside of extreme circumstances like the famous incidents at Glacier National Park in 1967, when 2 women were killed by grizzly bears on the same night. "What's your recommendation for immediate action?" Harrison asked during their radio conversation. "We need to consider temporary highway closures until we can locate and assess GB-47's current status. The evidence suggests he's actively patrolling this section of I-90, which creates an unacceptable risk for motorists." "Negative on highway closures unless we have an imminent threat. I-90 is a critical transportation corridor. We'll increase patrols and monitoring, but the road stays open unless we have a bear actually threatening traffic." The conversation reflected the complex balance between public safety and economic considerations that shaped wildlife management decisions throughout the American West. I-90 carried over 15,000 vehicles per day through this section of Montana, including substantial commercial traffic that formed the economic backbone of the region. Closing the highway required extraordinary justification and could only be sustained for short periods without causing significant economic disruption. At 2:45 p.m., Brian's truck crested McDonald Pass and began the long descent toward the Idaho border. The westbound lanes offered spectacular views of the mountains ahead, but they also required careful attention to speed control and brake management on the steep downgrade. Brian downshifted to utilize engine braking, a technique that reduced wear on his service brakes while maintaining safe speeds on the mountain descent. The CB radio crackled with reports from eastbound drivers about normal traffic conditions ahead, but Brian noticed that several drivers mentioned seeing wildlife near the roadway. These reports were typically brief and lacking in detail, as drivers focused on maintaining control of their vehicles rather than observing animals in the distance. "Big Sky Blue, this is eastbound Eddie on the flip side," came a voice Brian recognized as belonging to Edward Thomas Richardson, a 49-year-old driver from Spokane who regularly ran the I-90 corridor. "Go ahead, Eddie." "Heads up around mile marker 115. Saw something big moving around in the trees on the south side. Couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was definitely larger than a deer." "Copy that, Eddie. Thanks for the heads up." The report placed the potential wildlife sighting approximately 11 miles ahead of Brian's current position, in an area where the highway passed through particularly dense forest with limited visibility. Mile marker 115 was located at the bottom of a long downgrade where vehicles typically traveled at higher speeds, creating conditions where wildlife encounters could develop rapidly with limited reaction time. Dr. Foster's research had identified this specific section of highway as a high-risk wildlife corridor based on historical data and habitat analysis. The area featured several natural wildlife travel routes that intersected with the highway, creating predictable conflict zones where animal-vehicle collisions were statistically more likely to occur. At 3:10 p.m., Brian's truck passed mile marker 120, approximately 5 miles from the location mentioned in Eddie's radio report. The forest pressed close to both sides of the highway, with the tree line beginning just beyond the narrow shoulders. Visibility into the forest was limited to perhaps 50 yards due to the density of the vegetation and the irregular terrain. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle lower in the sky, creating conditions where shadows from the trees fell across portions of the roadway. These light and shadow patterns could make it difficult to spot movement in the forest, particularly for drivers whose attention was focused on navigating the winding mountain highway. What Brian couldn't know was that GB47 had been moving parallel to the highway for the past hour, following a ridgeline that provided the bear with an elevated view of the traffic below. The animal's behavior was unprecedented in Dr. Vasquez's experience, suggesting a level of interest in human activity that contradicted normal grizzly bear behavioral patterns. Trail cameras, positioned by Dr. Foster's research team, had captured images of GB47 earlier in the week, showing an animal in excellent physical condition, with an estimated weight of 800 pounds or more. The bear's distinctive facial scarring and notched left ear made identification certain, but the images also revealed behavioral changes that concerned the researchers. Unlike previous photographs that showed GB47 avoiding areas of human activity, the recent images depicted the bear actively investigating human scent trails, garbage, and abandoned campsites. This represented a dangerous escalation in the animal's habituation to human presence, suggesting that normal deterrent measures might prove ineffective. At 3:18 p.m., Brian's truck approached mile marker 115, the location where eastbound Eddie had reported seeing movement in the forest. Brian scanned the tree line as he drove, but the combination of highway speed, shadow patterns, and dense vegetation made it difficult to spot any animal that might be present. The truck's elevated cab position provided a better viewing angle than passenger vehicles, but it also meant that Brian's attention was divided between observing the forest and maintaining control of his vehicle on the winding mountain road. The section of highway between mile markers 115 and 110 featured several characteristics that wildlife researchers had identified as increasing the risk of animal vehicle encounters. The roadway curved frequently as it followed natural terrain features, limiting sight distances and reaction times. Steep embankments on both sides created natural funnels that directed animal movement toward the highway crossing points. Most significantly, several small streams crossed under the highway through culverts, creating natural wildlife corridors that animals used regularly for accessing water sources. Brian's truck reached mile marker 113 at 3:22 p.m., traveling at 65 miles per hour in compliance with posted speed limits for commercial vehicles. The diesel engine was working moderately hard to maintain speed on the rolling terrain, but all systems were operating normally. Fuel consumption was within expected parameters, and Brian estimated his arrival time in Spokane at approximately 6:30 p.m., allowing for fuel stops and traffic delays. At that exact moment, Dr. Vasquez's field team was receiving real-time telemetry data from motion-activated cameras positioned throughout the research area. Camera Station Alpha 7, located approximately 200 yards south of mile marker 113, had triggered multiple times in the past hour, indicating the presence of a large animal moving through the area. Maria Santos, monitoring the camera feeds from the Mobile Research Unit, immediately recognized the distinctive features of GB47 in the most recent images. The bear appeared to be moving deliberately toward the highway, following a well-established deer trail that led directly to a culvert crossing point beneath the roadway. Dr. Vasquez, we have positive identification of GB47, approaching the highway near mile marker 113, Maria reported via radio. Timestamp shows the bear was within 200 yards of the roadway as of 3:18 p.m. Copy that, Maria. What's the animal's current trajectory? Based on the camera sequence, GB47 appears to be moving directly toward the highway crossing at culvert C113. Estimated time to roadway contact is less than 10 minutes. The news triggered immediate emergency protocols that Dr. Vasquez had developed for exactly this type of situation. She immediately contacted Montana Highway Patrol Dispatch to request emergency response units, while simultaneously attempting to reach DOT supervisors who could implement temporary traffic control measures. However, the communication and response process required coordination between multiple agencies, each with their own protocols and command structures. Even under the best circumstances, mobilizing an effective response to a wildlife threat on a major highway required a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes from initial notification to deployment of personnel and equipment. At 3:25 p.m., Brian's truck passed the exact location where GB47 would emerge from the forest in less than 8 minutes. The massive grizzly bear was at that moment less than 100 yards from the highway, moving steadily through the dense undergrowth with the deliberate pace of an animal that had no fear of humans or their technology. Brian's CB radio remained quiet as he navigated through this section of highway, unaware that emergency response protocols were being activated in multiple agencies throughout the region. The beautiful Montana afternoon continued unchanged, with partly cloudy skies and excellent visibility that made the mountain scenery particularly spectacular. At 3:28 p.m., Brian began to experience the first mechanical issue of his day when the truck's engine temperature gauge began showing a slight increase above normal operating range. The change was subtle, within acceptable parameters for mountain driving, but Brian's experience made him immediately aware of the deviation. Professional drivers develop an intuitive sense for their vehicle's normal operating characteristics, and any change in engine behavior triggered automatic diagnostic thinking. Brian's first response was to check the gauge readings for all other engine systems. Oil pressure remained normal, turbo boost was within specifications, and exhaust gas temperature was acceptable for the current operating conditions. The slight temperature increase could be attributed to the mountain driving conditions, but prudent practice called for monitoring the situation closely and being prepared to pull over if the reading continued to rise. The truck's engine cooling system was designed to handle extreme operating conditions, including mountain grades, heavy loads, and high ambient temperatures. However, even the most robust systems could develop problems, and a cooling system failure while pulling a heavy load through mountain terrain could result in catastrophic engine damage, costing tens of thousands of dollars to repair. At 3:31 p.m., the engine temperature gauge showed another slight increase, moving into the upper range of acceptable operating temperatures, but not yet reaching alarm levels. Brian made the decision to begin looking for a safe location to pull over and inspect the cooling system, following standard operating procedures for any suspected mechanical issue. The timing of this mechanical concern would prove to be tragically significant, as it caused Brian to reduce his speed slightly and begin scanning the roadside for suitable places to pull over safely. This change in driving behavior placed him in exactly the wrong location at exactly the wrong time for the encounter that was about to unfold. At 3:33 p.m., GB47 emerged from the forest approximately 50 yards ahead of Brian's truck, stepping directly onto the shoulder of the westbound lanes of Interstate 90 near mile marker 112.5. The massive grizzly bear stood motionless for several seconds, apparently assessing the traffic situation with an intelligence and deliberation that would have surprised anyone who witnessed it. Brian spotted the bear immediately, his attention heightened by the mechanical concerns that had caused him to reduce speed and increase his vigilance. The animal was enormous, significantly larger than any bear Brian had ever seen in his 11 years of driving through bear country. The grizzly's distinctive brown fur showed the characteristic silver-tipped guard hairs that gave the species its common name, and its massive shoulder hump was clearly visible even from a distance of several hundred feet. Brian's first response was to slow his truck further and activate his emergency flashes to warn following traffic. The bear appeared calm and showed no immediate aggressive behavior, but its presence on the highway shoulder created an obvious safety hazard for all vehicles in the area. Brian reached for his CB radio to broadcast a warning to other drivers, while simultaneously scanning for a safe place to pull over and wait for the animal to leave the roadway. Attention westbound traffic near mile marker 112. This is Big Sky Blue. Large grizzly bear on the shoulder of the roadway. Reduce speed and use extreme caution. Animal appears calm but is blocking the right shoulder. The CB broadcast immediately triggered responses from other drivers in the area, including several who were already aware of the bear's presence. The animal had apparently been visible from the eastbound lanes for several minutes before Brian's arrival, and eastbound drivers had been attempting to contact westbound traffic without success due to the limitations of CB radio range in mountainous terrain. GB-47 remained motionless on the shoulder for approximately 45 seconds, during which time Brian was able to reduce his truck's speed to approximately 35 miles per hour while maintaining control on the downgrade. The bear's behavior appeared to be investigative rather than aggressive, suggesting that it might move away from the highway without creating a dangerous situation. However, at 3:34 p.m., the bear's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of retreating into the forest, as would be typical for most wildlife encountering highway traffic, GB-47 began moving deliberately toward the center of the roadway. The animal's movement was purposeful and unhurried, showing none of the typical fear response that characterized normal wildlife behavior around vehicles. Brian's options for avoiding the bear were severely limited by the highway's design and the presence of other traffic. The left lane was occupied by a passenger vehicle that had also spotted the bear and was attempting to pass safely. The shoulder areas on both sides of the highway featured steep embankments and guardrails that made emergency maneuvers impossible for a large commercial vehicle. As GB-47 continued moving toward the center of the highway, Brian made the decision to bring his truck to a complete stop rather than attempting to pass the animal at close range. This decision reflected both his training in defensive driving techniques and his recognition that provoking an aggressive response from such a large predator could have catastrophic consequences. The truck's air brakes engaged with the characteristic hissing sound of compressed air being released, and the massive vehicle began decelerating rapidly despite its significant momentum. The trailer's electronic braking system synchronized with the tractor's brakes to provide maximum stopping power while maintaining stability on the downgrade. At 3:34:30 p.m., Brian's truck came to a complete stop approximately 60 feet from the bear, which had positioned itself directly in the center of the westbound lanes. The animal showed no fear of the massive vehicle, instead appearing to study the truck with what could only be described as curiosity and intelligence. GB-47's head movements were deliberate and purposeful, suggesting that it was actively evaluating the situation rather than simply reacting to the presence of humans. Brian activated his hazard flashes and reached for his cell phone to call 911, recognizing that the situation had developed beyond what could be resolved by normal traffic management. The bear's behavior was outside the normal range of wildlife encounters, and professional intervention would be required to ensure the safety of all motorists in the area. The 911 call was answered on the second ring by Butte-Silver Bow County Emergency Dispatch, operated by dispatcher Jennifer Lynn Anderson, a 42-year-old career emergency services professional with 19 years of experience handling crisis situations throughout southwestern Montana. Butte-Silver Bow 911, what is your emergency? This is Brian Matthews. I'm a commercial truck driver on westbound I-90 near mile marker 112. There's a large grizzly bear blocking the highway and it's not moving away from traffic. We need wildlife authorities and probably highway patrol. Copy that, Mr. Matthews. Are you in immediate danger? Not at the moment, but this bear is acting very unusual. It's standing in the middle of the highway and doesn't seem afraid of vehicles. I've never seen anything like this before. Dispatcher Anderson immediately initiated protocols for wildlife-related highway emergencies, simultaneously contacting Montana Highway Patrol, Montana Department of Transportation, and Fish, Wildlife and Parks. The multi-agency response reflected the complexity of managing wildlife conflicts on major transportation corridors, where public safety concerns had to be balanced against wildlife conservation goals. While Brian was on the phone with 911, GB47 began moving again, this time directly toward his truck. The bear's approach was slow and deliberate, without the aggressive charging behavior that would typically characterize a predatory attack. Instead, the animal seemed to be investigating the vehicle with the same methodical curiosity it had shown throughout the encounter. The truck's diesel engine continued idling, creating vibrations and noise that should have deterred any normal wildlife. However, GB47 showed no response to these stimuli, continuing its approach until it was within 20 feet of the truck's front bumper. At this distance, Brian could clearly see the bear's facial scarring and the distinctive notch in its left ear that made identification certain. What Brian couldn't know was that he was experiencing the first documented case of a wild grizzly bear actively investigating a commercial vehicle on a major highway. Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Foster had theorized about such behavior based on increasing reports of bear-human interactions, but no researcher had ever observed such bold behavior in an uncontrolled environment. At 3:36 p.m., GB47 reached the front of Brian's truck and began investigating the vehicle with its sensitive nose, apparently analyzing the complex mixture of scents associated with diesel fuel, rubber tires, metal, and human presence. The bear's investigation was thorough and systematic, moving around the front bumper and examining various components of the truck's exterior. Brian remained in his cab, following emergency protocols that called for staying inside vehicles during wildlife encounters. The truck's cab was approximately 10 feet above ground level, providing some protection from ground-based threats, but the vehicle's windows and doors were designed for normal transportation use rather than defense against large predators. The bear's investigation continued for approximately 90 seconds, during which time Brian maintained constant communication with 911 dispatch, while other drivers in the area reported the situation via CB radio. The coordination of emergency response was complicated by the remote location and the need to position responding units safely without creating additional hazards or provoking the bear into aggressive behavior. At 3:37:30 p.m., GB47's behavior escalated dramatically. The bear reared up on its hind legs, bringing its full height to approximately 9 feet, and placed its front paws on the truck's front bumper. The impact of 800 pounds of bear making contact with the vehicle was immediately noticeable, causing the entire truck to rock slightly on its suspension system. Brian felt the truck's movement and immediately understood that the situation had become critically dangerous. A grizzly bear in direct physical contact with his vehicle represented a threat level that exceeded all of his training and experience. The animal's size and strength were sufficient to cause serious damage to the truck's exterior components, and its proximity to the cab created the possibility of a direct attack on the vehicle's occupant. 911, the bear is now physically touching my truck, Brian reported, his voice remaining remarkably calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. It's standing up against the front bumper. I need immediate assistance. Copy that, Mr. Matthews. Units are en route to your location. Stay in your vehicle and do not attempt to exit or make any loud noises that might provoke the animal. The dispatcher's advice reflected standard protocols for wildlife encounters, but the situation developing on I-90 was far outside the normal parameters of such encounters. GB-47's behavior suggested a level of boldness and curiosity about human technology that had never been documented in wild grizzly bears, creating a unique and unpredictable threat scenario. While maintaining his position on the truck's front bumper, GB-47 began investigating the vehicle's headlights, grille, and hood with both its nose and paws. The bear's claws, each approximately 4 inches long and designed for digging and climbing, scratched against the truck's metal and plastic surfaces, creating gouges and scrapes that would later serve as physical evidence of the encounter. The sound of the bear's claws against metal was clearly audible inside the truck's cab, a sharp scratching noise that reminded Brian of fingernails on a chalkboard, but magnified many times in volume and intensity. The psychological impact of hearing a large predator attempting to access his vehicle was profound, triggering stress responses that Brian struggled to control while maintaining communication with emergency dispatchers. At 3:39 p.m., GB-47 dropped back to all 4 feet and began moving along the driver's side of the truck, apparently investigating the fuel tanks and storage compartments located on that side of the vehicle. The bear's movement brought it directly adjacent to the driver's door, separated from Brian by approximately 12 feet of vertical distance and the truck's exterior skin. Brian could hear the bear moving around below him, its heavy footsteps clearly audible even over the noise of the idling diesel engine. Occasionally, the sound of claws against metal indicated that the animal was continuing its physical investigation of the vehicle's exterior components. The truck's side mirrors provided Brian with limited visibility of the bear's activities, but the confined viewing angles made it difficult to track the animal's exact position and behavior. The psychological pressure of being trapped inside a vehicle, while a large predator investigated the exterior, was unlike anything Brian had experienced in his civilian or professional life. His military training during his brief army service in 2010 to 2012 had included some exposure to high-stress situations, but nothing comparable to being stalked by an 800-pound grizzly bear while isolated on a mountain highway. Dr. Vasquez's emergency response team reached the vicinity of mile marker 112 at 3:41 p.m., but they were forced to position their vehicles at a safe distance to avoid interfering with the ongoing situation. Standard protocols called for allowing wildlife encounters to resolve naturally whenever possible, with human intervention reserved for situations where immediate threats to human life were present. "We have visual contact with the situation," Dr. Vasquez reported to the Joint Command Post that had been established to coordinate the emergency response. GB-47 is actively investigating a commercial vehicle with the operator trapped inside. The animal's behavior is unprecedented in our experience. Wildlife management protocols for such situations were limited and controversial. Lethal force against grizzly bears was considered a last resort due to the species' protected status and conservation concerns. But the safety of human lives took precedence over wildlife protection when direct conflicts occurred. The decision-making process was complicated by the bear's non-aggressive behavior, which didn't meet the typical criteria for authorizing lethal force. GB-47 was investigating rather than attacking, suggesting that the situation might be resolved without harm to either the bear or the human involved. At 3:42:30 p.m., the situation escalated again when GB-47 discovered the truck's passenger-side fuel tank. The bear's investigation of this component was more aggressive than its previous activities, involving both claws and teeth as it attempted to access the interior of the fuel system. The tank's aluminum construction was designed to withstand normal road hazards, but was not intended to resist investigation by a large predator. Brian heard the change in the bear's behavior through the metallic scratching and grinding sounds that indicated more aggressive contact with the vehicle. His training in hazardous materials transportation made him acutely aware of the dangers associated with fuel system damage, particularly the potential for diesel fuel leaks that could create fire hazards. 911, the bear is now attacking my fuel tank, Brian reported. I can hear it tearing at the metal. We could have a fuel leak situation developing. This report triggered additional emergency protocols related to hazardous materials incidents. Diesel fuel, while less volatile than gasoline, still represented a significant environmental and safety hazard if released in large quantities. The truck's fuel tanks contained approximately 180 gallons of diesel fuel, enough to create a major spill if the bear succeeded in breaching the tank's integrity. Fire department and hazardous materials response teams were added to the growing list of agencies responding to the incident, further complicating the coordination of emergency activities. The remote location and ongoing wildlife threat made conventional response procedures difficult to implement effectively. At 3:44 p.m., GB-47 successfully punctured the truck's passenger-side fuel tank, causing diesel fuel to begin streaming onto the highway surface. The bear's reaction to the fuel was immediate and dramatic, stepping back from the vehicle while showing signs of irritation and confusion. The strong chemical odor of diesel fuel appeared to overwhelm the bear's sensitive olfactory system, causing it to shake its head vigorously and paw at its nose. Brian could smell diesel fuel inside the cab and immediately recognized the implications of a fuel leak in the presence of hot engine components and electrical systems. He shut down the truck's engine to reduce ignition sources while maintaining communication with emergency dispatchers about the developing hazardous materials situation. Engine is shut down, but I have a significant fuel leak, Brian reported. The bear seems to be backing away from the truck, but I don't know if it's going to leave the area. The diesel fuel leak created a new dynamic in the emergency response, as hazardous materials protocols required the establishment of evacuation zones and specialized cleanup procedures. The environmental impact of diesel fuel contaminating a pristine mountain ecosystem was significant, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. GB-47's reaction to the diesel fuel provided the first indication that the bear might voluntarily disengage from the encounter. The animal had moved approximately 30 feet away from the truck and was showing obvious signs of distress related to the chemical contamination of its nasal passages. Wildlife experts monitoring the situation hoped that this negative stimulus might be sufficient to drive the bear away from the highway corridor. However, at 3:46 p.m., after spending nearly 2 minutes at a distance from the truck, GB-47 began approaching the vehicle again. The bear's movement was more aggressive than its previous investigations, suggesting that the diesel fuel incident had increased rather than decreased its agitation level. Brian observed the bear's return approach through his mirrors and immediately recognized that the animal's behavior had changed significantly. The methodical curiosity of the earlier encounter had been replaced by what appeared to be frustration and possible aggression, indicated by the bear's posture and movement patterns. "The bear is coming back, and it looks angry this time," Brian reported to dispatch. "I think the fuel leak made it mad instead of scaring it away." This development represented a critical escalation in the threat level, as an agitated grizzly bear posed a far greater danger than one that was simply curious. Wildlife experts monitoring the situation began discussing the possibility of intervention measures, including the use of non-lethal deterrence or, as a last resort, lethal force. At 3:47:30 p.m., GB-47 reached the driver's side of the truck and immediately began attempting to climb onto the vehicle's running boards and access the cab. The bear's claws found purchase on the truck's exterior surfaces, and its massive weight caused the entire vehicle to rock noticeably as it attempted to reach the driver's door. Brian could feel the truck moving under the bear's weight and realized that the animal was actively trying to access the cab. The driver's door was approximately 10 feet above ground level, but GB-47's size and climbing ability made it possible for the bear to reach the vehicle's entry points. 911, the bear is trying to get into my truck, Brian reported, his voice showing the first signs of stress as the situation reached a critical point. It's climbing up the side of the cab. The emergency response reached a decision point where intervention became necessary to prevent potential loss of human life. Dr. Vasquez authorized the use of non-lethal deterrents, including bear spray and noise-making devices, in an attempt to drive GB-47 away from the truck without causing permanent harm to the animal. However, the response team's position at a safe distance from the encounter made immediate intervention difficult. Approaching close enough to use non-lethal deterrents would require personnel to enter the bear's immediate territory, creating additional risks for emergency responders. At 3:48:45 p.m., GB-47 succeeded in reaching the truck's running board on the driver's side, bringing the massive predator within 6 feet of Brian's position inside the cab. The bear's weight on the running board caused the truck to list noticeably to the left, and the sound of claws against metal became a constant scratching and scraping that filled the cab with noise. Brian could see the bear's massive bulk through the driver's side window, close enough to observe individual details of the animal's fur, scars, and facial features. The proximity of such a large predator triggered immediate and powerful stress responses, including elevated heart rate, tunnel vision, and difficulty with fine motor control. The truck's windows were made of safety glass, designed to withstand normal impacts, but they were not intended to resist attacks by large predators. GB-47 began investigating the window with both nose and paws, leaving saliva smears and claw marks on the glass surface while searching for ways to access the interior of the cab. "I can see the bear right outside my window," Brian reported. His voice now clearly showing the strain of the prolonged encounter. "It's trying to get through the glass." The psychological impact of being trapped while a large predator attempted to access his location was overwhelming Brian's ability to maintain normal communication and decision-making processes. His military training provided some foundation for operating under stress, but the current situation exceeded anything he had experienced during his army service. At 3:50 p.m., the emergency response team made the decision to attempt a close approach using vehicles equipped with public address systems and emergency sirens. The goal was to create sufficient noise and commotion to drive GB-47 away from Brian's truck without causing harm to the bear or additional endangerment to human life. 2 Montana Highway Patrol vehicles began approaching the scene with emergency lights and sirens activated, while Dr. Vasquez's team prepared non-lethal deterrents for deployment if the noise failed to move the bear. The coordination of this response required precise timing to avoid creating confusion or additional hazards. GB-47's reaction to the approaching emergency vehicles was immediate, but not in the direction that responders had hoped. Instead of retreating from the increased human activity, the bear appeared to become more agitated and began attacking the truck's window with greater intensity. The safety glass began showing stress patterns under the impact of the bear's claws and the pressure from its massive weight against the doorframe. Brian could see spiderweb cracks beginning to develop in the window, indicating that the glass was approaching its failure point. "The window is starting to crack," Brian reported. "I don't think it's going to hold much longer." This development triggered the authorization for lethal force as a last resort to prevent imminent loss of human life. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel, armed with high-powered rifles, took positions to provide accurate fire if the bear succeeded in breaching the truck's cab. However, at 3:52:15 p.m., just as the situation reached its most critical point, GB-47 suddenly disengaged from the truck and began moving rapidly away from the highway. The bear's departure was as sudden and unexpected as its initial appearance, leaving emergency responders and Brian himself confused about what had triggered the change in behavior. The sound of approaching helicopters became audible in the distance as news media and additional emergency resources converged on the scene. The prolonged nature of the encounter had attracted attention from multiple agencies and news organizations, transforming what began as a wildlife encounter into a major regional news event. Brian remained in his truck for an additional 10 minutes, while emergency responders confirmed that GB-47 had retreated to a safe distance and established a secure perimeter around his vehicle. The psychological aftermath of the 18-minute encounter would prove to be as challenging as the physical events themselves. When emergency medical technicians finally reached Brian's truck at 4:05 p.m., they found him in a state of shock, but physically unharmed. His vital signs showed the classic indicators of severe stress: elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and hyperventilation consistent with acute anxiety response. Paramedic Susan Marie Collins, a 31-year-old career emergency medical technician with 12 years of experience, had never treated a victim of a prolonged wildlife encounter. Brian's condition was unique in her experience, combining elements of claustrophobia, predator fear, and survivor's guilt into a complex psychological presentation. "Mr. Matthews, you're safe now," Collins assured him as she conducted her initial assessment. "The bear is gone, and you're not injured. We're going to take good care of you." Brian's response to medical attention was complicated by his continued hypervigilance and difficulty accepting that the threat had ended. His eyes continuously scanned the surrounding area for signs of the bear's return, and he remained reluctant to exit the truck, even with multiple armed officers providing security. The truck itself bore extensive evidence of GB-47's investigation and attack. Deep claw marks scored the metal surfaces on multiple sides of the vehicle. The passenger side fuel tank showed puncture wounds that had caused the diesel fuel leak, and the driver's side window displayed stress cracks from the bear's attempts to access the cab. Dr. Vasquez's examination of the physical evidence confirmed that this had been the most extensive documented interaction between GB-47 and human technology. The bear's behavior throughout the encounter had been unprecedented in her experience, showing levels of persistence and boldness that exceeded all previous observations of the animal. This represents a fundamental change in GB-47's behavioral pattern, Dr. Vasquez explained to the incident commanders. The animal showed no fear of human technology, no response to normal deterrence, and active problem-solving behavior in attempting to access the vehicle's interior. This level of habituation and aggression makes GB-47 an immediate threat to public safety. The decision was made to authorize lethal removal of GB-47 if the bear could be located and positively identified. The animal's behavior during the highway encounter had exceeded all acceptable risk thresholds for human-wildlife coexistence, making continued tolerance of the bear's presence impossible from a public safety standpoint. However, GB-47 had disappeared into the dense forest following the encounter, and tracking the animal in the rugged mountain terrain would require extensive time and resources. The bear's demonstrated intelligence and adaptability suggested that future encounters might be even more dangerous, as the animal had now learned that vehicles could be breached with sufficient persistence. Brian was transported to St. James Healthcare in Butte for evaluation and treatment of stress-related symptoms. The 43-mile ambulance ride provided time for initial psychological first aid and medical stabilization before he reached the hospital's emergency department. Dr. Robert Charles Martinez, the emergency department physician who evaluated Brian, had extensive experience treating trauma patients, but had never encountered someone who had survived a prolonged predator encounter. Brian's psychological state showed classic symptoms of acute stress disorder, but the unusual nature of the triggering event made treatment protocols uncertain. Physically, Mr. Matthews is completely unharmed, Dr. Martinez explained to Sarah during a phone conversation at 5:30 p.m. However, he's experienced a severe psychological trauma that will require specialized treatment. I'm recommending admission for observation and consultation with our psychiatry department. Sarah's reaction to the news that her husband had been attacked by a bear while she was working her normal shift at a hospital 50 miles away was one of disbelief, followed by immediate concern. She arranged for emergency leave from her position and began the drive to Butte to be with Brian during his treatment. The news media response to the incident was immediate and extensive. The combination of a dramatic wildlife encounter, the highway closure it caused, and the availability of multiple emergency response agencies created perfect conditions for comprehensive news coverage. Channel 8. News from Butte dispatched reporter Patricia Ann Johnson and a camera crew to the scene within 30 minutes of receiving initial reports about the incident. Johnson, a 29-year-old broadcast journalist with 7 years of experience covering Montana news, recognized immediately that the story had national significance. This is Patricia Johnson reporting from Interstate 90 near Butte, where a truck driver has survived an 18-minute encounter with an 800-pound grizzly bear that attacked his vehicle, she reported in her initial live broadcast. Brian Matthews of Billings was trapped in his cab while the massive bear attempted to break into the truck, causing a fuel leak and shutting down the highway for hours. The story was picked up by national news networks within 2 hours, with CNN, Fox News, and other major outlets broadcasting footage from the scene and interviewing wildlife experts about the unprecedented nature of the encounter. The combination of dramatic visuals and the unusual behavior of the bear made it compelling television that attracted viewers across the country. Dr. Foster provided expert commentary for several news outlets, explaining the significance of GB-47's behavior and the implications for wildlife management throughout the region. Her analysis helped educate the public about the complex factors driving increased human-wildlife conflicts in the modern West. What we witness today represents a new level of boldness in grizzly bear behavior that we haven't documented before, Dr. Foster explained during a live television interview. This particular bear has shown no fear of humans or their technology, making it a significant threat to public safety that will require immediate management action. The incident sparked renewed debate about grizzly bear management policies throughout Montana and the broader northern Rockies region. Conservation groups argued that GB-47's behavior was an isolated incident that didn't justify changes to protective regulations, while others pointed to the encounter as evidence that bear populations had exceeded the carrying capacity of available habitat. Governor of Montana, Elizabeth Ann Walsh, issued a statement calling for a comprehensive review of wildlife management policies and increased funding for research into human-wildlife conflict prevention. The governor's response reflected the political sensitivity of wildlife issues in a state where conservation and economic interests often conflicted. The safety of Montana citizens and visitors must be our highest priority, Governor Walsh stated. While we remain committed to wildlife conservation, we cannot tolerate situations where protected species pose direct threats to human life. The cleanup of the diesel fuel spill required specialized environmental response teams and continued for 3 days following the incident. Approximately 45 gallons of diesel fuel had leaked onto the highway surface and surrounding soil, requiring excavation and remediation to prevent long-term environmental damage. The Montana Department of Environmental Quality supervised the cleanup process, which included removal of contaminated soil, treatment of affected vegetation, and monitoring of nearby water sources for contamination. The total cost of environmental remediation exceeded $75,000, representing one of the largest wildlife-related environmental incidents in recent Montana history. Brian's truck required extensive repairs, totaling more than $18,000, to address the damage caused by GB-47's investigation and attack. The insurance claim process was complicated by the unusual nature of the incident, as wildlife damage to commercial vehicles on public highways represented a rare coverage scenario that required detailed investigation. The trailer and its cargo were undamaged during the encounter, allowing the shipment to be completed by another driver after Brian's truck was removed from the scene. However, the delivery delay caused contractual complications and financial penalties that affected multiple parties in the transportation chain. Brian's recovery from the psychological trauma of the encounter proved to be more challenging than anyone initially anticipated. Despite having no physical injuries, he experienced persistent symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, hypervigilance, and anxiety attacks that made returning to truck driving impossible. Dr. Jennifer Lynn Patterson, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, began treating Brian 3 days after the incident. Her assessment revealed that the prolonged nature of the encounter, combined with the sense of helplessness while trapped in the truck, had created a complex trauma presentation that would require months of intensive therapy. Mr. Matthews experienced a type of trauma that is extremely rare in our society, Dr. Patterson explained to Sarah during a family therapy session. The combination of predator fear, confinement, and the extended duration of the threat created conditions that challenged his most basic survival instincts. Sarah's own adjustment to Brian's trauma proved difficult, as she struggled to understand the psychological impact of an experience that seemed unimaginable to someone who hadn't lived through it. Her medical training helped her understand the clinical aspects of his condition, but it didn't prepare her for the emotional challenges of supporting a spouse through severe PTSD recovery. The financial impact of Brian's inability to work created additional stress for the family. Workers' compensation coverage for the incident was complicated by questions about whether the attack occurred during normal work duties or represented an extraordinary circumstance outside normal employment risks. Brian's employer, Mountain States Transportation, had never encountered a situation where a driver was disabled by a wildlife attack. The company's policies and insurance coverage were designed for conventional transportation risks rather than the unique circumstances of predator encounters. The legal implications of the incident extended beyond worker compensation issues to questions of liability and responsibility for wildlife management. Several law firms contacted Brian about potential lawsuits against various government agencies for failing to prevent the encounter, though such cases faced significant legal hurdles. The search for GB-47 continued for 6 weeks following the highway incident, involving teams from multiple agencies and utilizing sophisticated tracking technology. Trail cameras, scent detection, and helicopter surveys failed to locate the bear, suggesting that it had either left the area or had learned to avoid human detection methods. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the bear's behavior patterns indicated that GB47 had demonstrated problem-solving abilities and adaptability that exceeded normal grizzly bear intelligence. The animal's ability to disappear completely following such a high-profile incident suggested that it had learned from the encounter and modified its behavior accordingly. "We're dealing with an individual bear that has shown exceptional intelligence and adaptability," Dr. Vasquez reported to state wildlife officials. GB47's ability to evade detection following the highway incident indicates that conventional tracking methods may be ineffective against this particular animal. The failure to locate GB47 created ongoing public safety concerns throughout the region. The bear's demonstrated willingness to attack vehicles and its apparent lack of fear of humans made it a continuing threat to anyone who might encounter it in the future. Public reaction to the incident was intense and polarized, reflecting broader divisions about wildlife management and human safety in areas where large predators were present. Some residents called for more aggressive bear management policies, while others argued that humans needed to accept some level of risk when living in wildlife habitat. The Montana legislature held hearings on wildlife management policies in response to the incident, hearing testimony from wildlife biologists, public safety officials, and affected citizens. The debate reflected the complex balance between conservation goals and public safety that characterized wildlife policy throughout the American West. Representative Michael James Thompson of Bozeman introduced legislation that would mandate more aggressive management of problem bears and increase funding for wildlife control programs. The bill faced opposition from conservation groups who argued that lethal management of bears should remain a last resort. The attack on Mr. Matthews represents a fundamental failure of our current wildlife management system, Representative Thompson argued during legislative hearings. We cannot allow protected species to pose direct threats to human life while we debate the finer points of conservation policy. Environmental groups countered that isolated incidents should not drive policy changes that could undermine decades of conservation progress. They pointed out that bear attacks remain statistically rare events that should not overshadow the broader success of grizzly bear recovery programs. Brian's story became a focal point for these broader policy debates, with both sides using his experience to support their arguments about appropriate wildlife management approaches. The attention was unwelcome for Brian and Sarah, who preferred to focus on recovery rather than political advocacy. 6 months after the incident, Brian had made significant progress in his psychological recovery, but remained unable to return to truck driving. The sight of large vehicles or the sound of diesel engines continued to trigger anxiety responses that made commercial driving impossible. Dr. D. Patterson's treatment had helped Brian develop coping strategies for managing his PTSD symptoms, but the trauma had fundamentally altered his relationship with the career that had defined his adult life. The loss of his professional identity as a truck driver represented a secondary trauma that complicated his overall recovery process. Sarah returned to her nursing career, but found that her own experience as a trauma spouse had changed her perspective on patient care and family dynamics. She began volunteering with support groups for families affected by wildlife encounters, sharing the lessons she had learned during Brian's recovery. The Matthews family eventually relocated to a smaller community away from major highways, where Brian found work in a local hardware store that allowed him to avoid the triggers associated with commercial transportation. The change represented a significant reduction in income and lifestyle, but it provided the stability necessary for continued psychological healing. 1 year after the encounter, GB47 remained at large, despite ongoing efforts to locate and capture the animal. The bear had apparently learned to avoid all forms of human detection, suggesting that it remained in the area but had become completely nocturnal and secretive in its behavior. Dr. Vasquez published a comprehensive analysis of the incident in the Journal of Wildlife Management, describing GB47's behavior as representing a new category of human-wildlife conflict that required updated management approaches. Her research contributed to a broader understanding of grizzly bear intelligence and adaptability. The highway encounter became a case study in emergency response coordination, highlighting both the successes and failures of multi-agency response to wildlife emergencies. The lessons learned from the incident influenced training programs and protocols throughout the region. Brian's truck was eventually repaired and returned to service with Mountain States Transportation, but it carried permanent scars from the encounter in the form of claw marks that couldn't be completely removed. The vehicle became something of a legend among professional drivers, who referred to it as the Bear Truck in CB radio conversations. The section of Interstate 90 where the encounter occurred was designated as a wildlife crossing zone with enhanced warning signs and electronic notification systems. However, no further encounters with GB47 were reported, suggesting that the bear had either died, left the area, or learned to avoid highways completely. 2 years after the incident, Brian had developed sufficient coping skills to consider returning to driving, though not in commercial trucking. He began taking short trips in a personal vehicle, gradually rebuilding his confidence behind the wheel while maintaining the support systems that had aided his recovery. Sarah completed additional training in trauma counseling and began working with families affected by various types of wildlife encounters throughout Montana. Her experience with Brian's recovery provided unique insights into the challenges faced by both victims and their families during the healing process. The legal resolution of Brian's case took nearly 3 years, ultimately resulting in a settlement that provided financial support for his ongoing medical treatment and retraining for a new career. The case established important precedents for worker compensation coverage of wildlife-related injuries in Montana. GB47 was never seen again after the highway encounter, leading wildlife officials to conclude that the bear had either died or permanently left the region. The animal's disappearance remained a mystery that continued to fascinate researchers and the public alike. Dr. Foster's research team eventually published a comprehensive study of the incident that became a landmark work in understanding human-wildlife conflict dynamics. The study's findings influenced wildlife management policies throughout North America and contributed to international research on large carnivore behavior. The story of Brian Matthews and GB47 became part of Montana folklore, told and retold in truck stops, hunting camps, and wildlife management circles throughout the region. The encounter served as a reminder of the unpredictable and potentially dangerous nature of the wilderness that still existed in the modern American West. 5 years after the encounter, Brian had successfully transitioned to a new career in construction management and had largely overcome the psychological effects of his trauma. He occasionally spoke at wildlife safety seminars, sharing his story to help others understand the importance of proper precautions in bear country. The incident continued to influence wildlife management policies and emergency response protocols throughout the Northern Rockies, serving as a case study in the complex challenges of managing human-wildlife interactions in an increasingly developed landscape. The lessons learned from that April afternoon in 2025 would continue to inform conservation and safety efforts for decades to come. The legacy of the encounter extended beyond policy and procedure to touch the lives of everyone involved, from Brian and Sarah Matthews to the emergency responders who witnessed the unprecedented behavior of a single grizzly bear that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife behavior in the modern world.